All right, welcome everyone to the final episode of the Gay Science Book 3. And obviously it's not the final episode of the Gay Science period, because we are going to return after the season, after season 5 is over, and cover Book 4. But today we're going to go through the last of these rapid-fire aphorisms, these moral maxim style sections that end Book 3 of the Gay Science. And there's a lot here, and even though I've said this before, I will say it again. I will not give as much commentary on these because we're going to cover 100 aphorisms today. And it's not just in the interest of time, it's because they're very compact, they're very short and sweet, and the more you kind of untangle and unpack and unbox them, the less elegant they get. So I like to keep my commentary on these relatively short, relatively to the point, just to sort of convey any comment or additional note that I have or anything I can do to elucidate where Nietzsche's being a bit more obscure or something like that. So let's start with 176, quote, "Pity, poor reigning princes. All of their rights are suddenly changing into claims, and all of these claims begin to sound like presumption. Even if they only say we or my people, malicious old Europe begins to smile. Surely a chief master of ceremonies in the modern world would waste little ceremony on them and might well decree les souverains rangeant aux parvenus," which, end quote, that means sovereigns belong with parvenus. So a parvenu is someone who rises from a lowly or obscure origin to become prominent or celebrity or rich. Basically new money, right? That's how we would talk about it in America, where we don't really have a class system, we just have rich and poor. But the aphorism is entitled Pity, and the pity is for the reigning princes whose rights are suddenly changed into claims. So we have to remember what Nietzsche says about the Ancient Regime in France. The moment where their downfall becomes inevitable is when their divine right to rule is no longer conceived as such, where we no longer believe in that idea. And if we go back to ancient Greece, if we look at Theognis of Megara, who is the subject of Nietzsche's dissertation, he also brings out that element there when discussing how Theognis is part of this aristocracy that is brought down by these revolutions, and there's sort of this whole social trend, this political trend in ancient Greece of democracies rising up and giving rise to tyrants. And Theognis is part of this aristocracy that falls. He goes into exile. When he returns, there's no longer this hard distinction between aristocrat and plebeian. It is just sort of rich and poor, the way we would talk about it in contemporary American society. There's no longer a distinction, an order of rank between people who are nobly born versus base-born. And the reason why this can be catastrophic for society is because at that point, the people on the bottom rungs of society perceive that there is no essential difference between them and the ones who have wealth and have power. And Nietzsche says the ones who have wealth and have power often reveal that they're not people of virtue. They're not people who could even claim to have a divine right to rule. Nietzsche talks about this earlier in The Gay Science, about the worker looking up at the image of the factory boss and how unvirtuous he is, how unimpressive he is. He also speaks about this in Human All Too Human, how the desire to possess wealth is equally there in the socialists as it is in the rich. And if the rich were deprived of their wealth, they themselves would be socialists. They make all these sort of moral aspersions against the socialists as just being anarchic, dissolute people. But if you take away all their wealth, they would be the same, because that's the only thing driving or animating the society at this point. And so the prince begins to look like no more than someone who just found his way into wealth or power by happenstance. And the minute that becomes the common perception, you can no longer have princes. It doesn't work anymore. And so Nietzsche has pity for these poor reigning princes, because their reign is sure to come to an end under this new moral valuation. All right, so let's go to 177, quote, "On the educational establishment. In Germany, higher men lack one great means of education, the laughter of higher men. For in Germany, these do not laugh, end quote. On the one hand, this is just a comment on the humorless nature of the German culture. But there's like a real critique there. There's a section where Nietzsche says, I forget exactly where this is, but where he says that Germans make dispassion into a virtue because of a lack of passion. So there's a difference between being dispassionate because you've like reined in your passions or something like that, or just simply making your lack into a virtue. I mean, that's one of Nietzsche's main critiques of Christianity, is that all its virtues are the virtues of lack. So that's what happens in the German university system. And it's very informative to read Nietzsche's fragmentary essay, We Philologists. Remember, Nietzsche was a philologist, and that's really the basis of a lot of his comments on scholars. Also see the section We Scholars and Beyond Good and Evil, that only a passionate man, only a creator could really understand the Greeks, if we're looking specifically at the field of philology. And yet, the philologist is the farthest type of person from a passionate man or a creator. So they're ill-suited to the task. He says our philologists in no way attempt to imitate the Greeks. How can they know the Greeks? They're scholars of classical philology. What does it mean to be classical? What is a classic? Well, a classic was a example, like a rubric. A classic was something that sort of sets a class, right? It is a thing to be imitated. So classical antiquity is what we ought to imitate if we want to look to how to produce large numbers of geniuses, for example. Like the Greek world has the most geniuses of any culture ever to exist. Whether you think that's true or not, that's what Nietzsche thinks. And so he says, of our philologists, though, what's classical about them? Do we find artists and creative geniuses among the ranks of classicists? No, in fact, we do not. We find a bunch of mere scholars. He says, really, one of the only people who actually takes ancient Greece and turns it into something, uses it as the raw material for creativity, is Goethe. And he says Goethe didn't even know as much about ancient Greece as many of the philologists did. So the important thing is not accumulating all of these trivial facts. It's what you do with that knowledge. And so to return it to the laughter of higher men, for in Germany these do not laugh, the dispassion of the German scholar. And we might say, it's not just Germany, because he is talking about educational establishments. It's also interesting to consider his comments on laughter in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, especially. Like dance, laughter is an expression of, in the broadest possible sense, you could say amor fati. Laughter is an expression of joy, yes, but consider dancing as another aspect he talks about a great deal in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. When you dance, you're moving your body for no other reason than the joy of doing it, and laughter as well. Laughter is this meaningless expression of sounds that just purely expresses joy. And so can a dispassionate scholar, is their laughter even real laughter? Might be the way to look at it. Let's go to 178, quote, on moral enlightenment, one has to talk the Germans out of their Mephistopheles and their Faust as well. These are two moral prejudices against the value of knowledge, end quote. And this is a very interesting one because Nietzsche, I think, is undoubtedly influenced by Faust. He references Faust in Birth of Tragedy as a counterpart to Socrates. He says, Socrates and Faust stand as sort of like the alpha and omega of the truth drive, the knowledge drive, become a way of life. So Socrates stands at the beginning of this. Socrates comes into being in the society that is proudly ignorant in some ways, proudly irrational in some ways. And Socrates imposes the duty, the virtue of being rational on the Greek society. And for Socrates, this was a thing yet to come. So he hadn't yet seen the consequences of where this could lead. Faust is at the end of it, so Faust is searching for a coast on the wide waste of the oceans of knowledge. Faust has conquered all the faculties of the German university. He's found everything there is to find in earthly knowledge, and so then he begins to practice magic. He begins to go back to those irrational and superstitious ways, those mystical ways of finding knowledge. And his search becomes a search for happiness, sort of overcoming knowledge, overcoming the drive for knowledge and searching for happiness. And of course, his partner in this is Mephistopheles, the devil, who is sort of like a representative of the human intellect, that he is the doubting thought of God. He's the accusing thought of God. We see this in sort of the recreation of the book of Job in the prologue of Goethe's Faust. He says that it is his role to negate. He says that whatever can be negated deserves to be. And there we might think of Hegel and his doctrine of, or his understanding of logic as negation, moving forward by negation. And so why do the Germans need to overcome Faust and Mephistopheles? Well, the gay science, this whole book represents a sort of newfound love for truth on the other side of that Faustian confrontation with the failure or the collapse of the theoretical way of life. The fact that it does not lead you to happiness. It does not lead you to what might be more important to Nietzsche, health, life enhancement, so on and so forth. That it presented itself as a dead end. And yet Nietzsche, as a philosopher, has to construct a new operation, a new way of viewing the pursuit of truth. And we've discussed this throughout the book. I mean, this is, you could call it the gay science, the carefree science, the devil-may-care science, and that's perhaps a good way to put it, because when one says the devil may care, we're leaving the devil behind, in a sense. So we're leaving Mephistopheles behind. We're leaving that Christian association of the devilishness of the intellect behind, and we're leaving behind Faust too, even though he presented a very useful image of striving as a source of salvation. Nevertheless, the condemnation of the pursuit of truth, it's important because it destroys, it implodes the theoretical way of life, the theoretical domination of the will to truth. And that's really what Nietzsche's trying to do. He's trying to take the will to truth from the Socratic theoretical way of life. Let's go to 179, quote, "Thoughts are shadows of our feelings, always darker, emptier, and simpler," end quote. And Nietzsche speaks quite a bit about this, and we've spoken quite a bit about this on the podcast, that there's a sort of reasoning that goes on in the unconscious, that the unconscious is where the activity is, that the intellect is a commentary on an unknown text, which is the body. Each drive has its own form of reasoning, its own form of logic. And so that's all simplified into the idea of feelings, that where the activity is, again, is a drive. We could call it emotional, but that's because using feelings is sort of almost like an allegory to point to what Nietzsche is talking about, because the point is that it's pre-rational, and then rationality follows after, like a shadow follows, a human being walking in the sunlight. And the shadow is, what does he say? Darker, emptier, and simpler. That our thoughts, the taking a drive, taking basically some sort of fundamental evaluation or judgment, which is really what is always involved in drive, which is always involved in willing, and then turning that into a fact about the world, which is really just an interpretation of the world following after that drive. It always represents a simplification. How is a shadow? It doesn't have all of the three dimensions, right? And it's empty, it's hollow, and that's how Nietzsche thinks about the relationship between word concepts, in which we normally think, and feelings, which here stands for drive. Let's go to 180, quote, "A good age for free spirits. Free spirits take liberties even with science, and so far get away with it as long as the church still stands. To that extent, this is a good age for them," end quote. And the way I read this one is that science as an ideology and religion as an ideology, whether you want to call whatever science is today a new religion or not, it's not really important. Scientific positivism is the guiding star for many people. It is their metaphysics and their morality. So it's serving that same function. And what this does is when there's an interregnum between them, when science and religion are still in battle, the free spirit within that chaos can kind of play with science a little bit more. Remember what Nietzsche says in the preface to Birth of Tragedy, his second preface, where he says, to regard science from the point of view of the artist and to regard art from the point of view of life. That's Nietzsche's goal. That's his goal throughout a lot of this book. You can say he's taking liberties with what science means, right? Sort of, he's made many far-reaching statements about science, not as, just the scientific method, not just the methodology, not just a strict, rigorous definition of science, but science as a drive, science as a way of life, science as a series of valuations about the world. And Nietzsche's allowed to do this because there's still this sort of question, there's still this sort of conflict between the old grounding ideology and the new. But once the new grounding ideology becomes all-encompassing and far-reaching, taking these liberties with science might make you a heretic, in the similar way that you might be a heretic to one of the old religions. So it's a good age for the free spirits. These ages of comparison, these ages of chaos, are always a good age for people who want to be freed from all such models or all such grounding ideologies, or at least have the liberty to play with them. Let's go to 181, quote, following and walking ahead. A says, of these two, one will always follow and the other will always walk ahead, wherever fate may lead them. And yet the former excels the other one in virtue as well as spirit. B says, and yet, you speak for the benefit of the others, not for me, not for us. Fit secundum regulum. End quote. And that last phrase means this is the rule. So, of these two, one will always follow and the other will always walk ahead, but the former, the one who always follows, excels the other in virtue as well as spirit. And I think there is something in this passage that we could look at the way Nietzsche talks about proceeding through various convictions. We might also consider the camel, the lion, and the child. There are people who follow. There are people who take on the burdens of past valuations, conceptions, worldviews, whatever the case may be, and actually do so quite virtuously and maybe even with more vitality than people who are just trying to rush ahead. And to use an example from music, jazz is often mischaracterized as a kind of like musical anarchy, but jazz musicians, among all modern musicians, probably know more about music theory than almost everyone, other than maybe the most erudite classical scholar of music. Not even the classical musicians, but the ones who study counterpoint and all these past all of the great composers and really learn the intricacies of what they're doing, which is a mathematical thing, by the way, when you really get into really complex music. And so the jazz musician learns everything, takes on all of that, the rules, and so that they can then be an exception, right? But what about the person who just wants to be an exception before they learn the rules? And I think that's what this first person, A, is speaking about. But then B says, and yet you speak for the benefit of others, not for me, not for us. You're speaking of the rule. This is the rule that you're giving. What about the exception? So what about the exceptional person who is himself an exception in that case, in that they run ahead without having learned any of the rules, without having taken on any of that camel-like duties, and still outmatch the people who live their lives according to the rule. They outmatch them in terms of their virtue and spirit. And we might think of somebody like Heraclitus, who is solitary, regal, self-legislating, all these things that Nietzsche says about him. And so there are some people who do create a new, exceptional, powerful new worldview or way of life or something like that without first being duty-bound camels. It is possible. Let's go to 182 in Solitude. Quote, those who live alone do not speak too loud, nor write too loud, for they fear the hollow echo, the critique of the nymph echo, and all voices sound different in solitude. End quote. So we obviously have the reference to the Greek myth there from where we get the word echo, but all voices sound different in solitude, including one's own voice. That's really the voice that Nietzsche is speaking about here. Those who live alone do not speak too loud nor write too loud, so that the echo doesn't come back to you. So there is a sense in which solitude requires that discipline of you. It requires you to not become too forceful, too loud, quote unquote. This is really a metaphor, because write too loud, how do you write too loud? Well, when one is speaking loudly, then no one else can be heard. And so if you're writing in such a way that no counter thought, no objection can possibly be heard, your thoughts will just sort of be echoing within your brain back and forth, just sending you down. I mean, we might say an echo chamber. You become your own echo chamber in solitude. It's a very useful metaphor that we now use in the modern world. And of course, an echo chamber can occur out in public, out in the broader community, but you risk becoming an echo chamber of one in solitude. That's the way in which everything sounds different. So you have to not speak too loud or write too loud, or you'll risk becoming your own echo chamber. Let's go to 183, quote, "The music of the best future I should account as the foremost musician, one who knew only the sadness of the most profound happiness, and no other sadness at all. But such a musician has never existed yet," end quote. And obviously, the music of the future originally referred to Richard Wagner. That's how his music was referred to. That's how Nietzsche understood Wagner's music. He writing a philosophy of the future is a direct reference to Wagner's. But here he asks, what is the best music of the future? So is Wagner really providing us with the best music of the future? What do I look for in that? Well, a musician who knows profound sadness only in the most profound happiness. And there's a way in which profound happiness is always tinged with sadness because of the fact, well, you might just say because of the impermanence of life, the beauty of all impermanent things, that you know this too shall pass, right? And so when you have those supreme moments of accomplishment or contentment or love or something, any of these things, in the back of your mind, there's the knowledge that it will all one day slip away from you like sand through your fingers. And this is the basis of the Buddhist worldview, and Schopenhauer after them, that sort of says a happy life is impossible because it's always tinged with sadness. Here, Nietzsche, it's not like he provides a counter-argument to that. He sort of says the best music, the best art, the greatest achievement of art would be by he only knows sadness through that moment of the most profound happiness. There's also a passage where Nietzsche says, be blissful and then create, right? Then go out and do your great works. Don't go and live your life in pursuit of being blissful. Rather, we should reevaluate all acts of creation to referring to whether or not the person who created the art or the valuation or the philosophy or the religion or whatever was blissful, right? That should be our standard. How well disposed are you to life? That should be the starting point. And Nietzsche says he knows of no music like that as of yet. That's why it's in the future, of course. So 184, quote, "Justice, I'd sooner have people steal from me than be surrounded by scarecrows and hungry looks. That is my taste. And this is by all means a matter of taste, nothing more," end quote. Scarecrows is one of the ways that Nietzsche attacks the scholars and we philologists. He says they're scarecrows. Kaufman points out that it's used to, quote, "refer to terribly thin and undernourished people," end quote. So it's sort of a German colloquialism. And obviously Nietzsche's not using it to refer to literally malnourished people when he calls the scholars scarecrows. He's again referring to that lack of passion, that lack of creative vitality. And so he'd rather be around people who would steal from his own fire rather than being around people who are so emaciated and so malnourished. Like they don't even know anything about their own, they're not even aware of their own lack of vitality, right? They're these dried up erudite worms tunneling into books for trivial facts. They don't even know to steal from those around them. They don't even know what it is that they're lacking. And I would just say, as a final note about myself, I do have like a small intellectual circle of friends, and we very much enjoy stealing from one another. No one is precious about, there's something about that attitude of trying to cling on to your insights and hold on to them, and they're just mine and mine alone, that betrays a sort of impoverished engagement with philosophy and with ideas. We all steal each other's ideas. We all want to steal each other's ideas. We want to be stolen from. Because, that's generosity, right? And that's a truly productive, what might we say, scholarly or philosophical engagement. And Nietzsche calls it in this aphorism, justice, right? To steal. So he's being cheeky there. Let's go to 185, a related aphorism, quote, poor. He is poor today, but not because one has taken everything away from him. He has thrown away everything. What is that to him? He is used to finding things. It is the poor who misunderstand his voluntary poverty, end quote. So definitely see the section, The Voluntary Beggar, and Thus Spoke Zarathustra. There's not very much to say about this here, but voluntary poverty in the sense of, to perhaps use a vulgar example, we might think of Ozymandias from Watchmen, where there's a whole section where he describes how he was born into wealth and power, but he intentionally squandered his entire fortune, and then he went off into the desert to meditate and sort of has like a spiritual reawakening, and then completely rebuilds an even greater empire of industry and so on and so forth. So Ozymandias is someone who becomes a voluntary beggar. He intentionally throws away all of these adornments, all of the wealth and power that he's born with, and finds who he is. And, this need not apply to literal wealth and power. It's really an analogy. We might look at it also in the perspective of all the virtues you're raised with, all the moral values you're raised with. Maybe you're born into a station of comfort or something like that, and intentionally throwing all of that away. But in order to become richer through your poverty, let's go to 186, quote, bad conscience. Everything he is doing now is decent and in order, and yet he has a bad conscience, for the extraordinary is his task, end quote. And Kaufman points out there's a play on words here that doesn't come through in English. So to say in order in German, everything he's doing is decent and in order, that would be ordentlich, and extraordinary would be außerordentlich. So there's a contrast here between everything he's doing is decent and in order, but he's guilty over it. He has a bad conscience over it because the extraordinary is his task. And this simply refers us back to the comments that Nietzsche has had about the herd morality and the conscience being the voice of the herd morality. So the bad conscience basically telling anyone who tries to do something exceptional, push beyond the boundaries of what is currently acceptable, what is currently considered moral or right, or part of the existing order. Anyone who pushes beyond that will have the herd voice of conscience, the herd instinct in the individual, basically stinging him, biting him, the bite of conscience, just for the sake of doing that. Even if what is extraordinary might be precisely what is needed, right? Even if everything he's doing is decent and in order, he will still find that the herd consciousness or the herd conscience tugs and stings at him. Let's go to 187, quote, offensive presentation. This artist offends me by the manner in which he presents his ideas, although they are very good. His presentation is so broad and emphatic and depends on such crude artifices of persuasion as if he addressed a mob. Whenever we give some time to his art, we are soon as if, quote, in bad company, end quote. And I don't think this is terribly difficult to understand. I think in the era of contemporary art and mass culture, every artist has to justify their project by speaking to the crowd, speaking to the mob, and again, rushing to the lowest common denominator with how they speak about the meaning and the value of their work. Not that these were great works of art that were tarnished by these comments. They were not great works of art. But at least the original incarnation, people could arguably say 1977 Star Wars was a great work of art. And then when we think about like the comments made by the people involved with that production in The Last Jedi, the Star Wars film that killed Star Wars, I just remember Carrie Fisher saying, it's about family. And that's what's so powerful about it. And not as that such a trite and just like really shallow, unimpressive summation of the project. Not that there was actually some depth there that she was missing, but just like the value of family, right? That is so lowest common denominator that it literally applies to pretty much any human being who's ever lived has been part of a family. So it's about the most ordinary thing in the world, right? And it is true. Great art must often draw upon the universal in order to reach profundity. But when you just say, when your whole summation of it is, it's about family, I mean, you're really speaking of Star Wars in the same language that the Fast and Furious films talk, the way that the actors and the characters talk as regards the value of those films. And what could be a better example of the lowest common denominator than that? So really, that is, above anything, that's the experience that many of us have when we when we see the presentation, the way that new works of art, if we can even call them that, are presented. They are presented in these terms which are so pandering and trite and superficial, and one feels as though they're tarnished just by being a part of it. And that's how I feel about all of these major franchises now. I don't want to be a fan of any of them, and I'm not. I haven't seen any of these Marvel or Star Wars or any of these mass culture productions for a long time. I was as much... my inner teenager came out as much when the Marvel Cinematic Universe first started, or when the Star Wars prequels came out when I was a kid. But at a certain point, you got to put away childish things. And there is something about the whole zeitgeist, the whole artistic zeitgeist is so childish now, because it does pander to the values of the virtues that, again, a child could understand. Well, it's all just about family, right? You feel condescended to, just even with listening to directors talk about their films now. It's very sad. All right, let's go to 188, quote, "Work. How close work and the worker are now even to the most leisurely among us. The royal courtesy of the saying, 'We are all workers,' would have been cynical and indecent as recently as the reign of Louis XIV, end quote." This is another thing that I think is very applicable to modern popular culture. The idea, let's remember something that was often said during COVID-19, and in fact was said in these video dispatches by these major celebrities and Hollywood actors to kind of poke fun at them again. We're all in this together. And there's something about that when... what would you say? When the boss says I'm a worker just like you with the other workers. Or when the person who lives in the gated community says, I'm in this together with all of you who are, still working your shift throughout like all of these lockdowns and having to like hunt for food on empty shelves. I'm getting my food delivered, but we're all in it together because we all have to stay home, right? And so what's funny about this is that what Nietzsche actually says in this passage is that the situation has changed, that it would have been cynical and indecent for someone like Louis XIV to say we are all workers. But how things have changed, how work and the worker are so close to even the leisurely among us. And I guess what I would say is, I think it's helpful to just set aside Nietzsche's point about whether that's changed or not. We can just note there is an aspect of bourgeois society, of meritocratic capitalism that attempts to make that claim. We're all just workers together, right? We're just different kinds of workers. The CEO is actually a really hard worker, It kind of makes that equivalence of like anyone who has their station in life got that from their merit. They got that way from their hard work, or however we want to conceive of it. And whether it's because we are returning to a new, like, era of Louis XIV's, where the gap, the distance, the vast gulf between someone like Jeff Bezos and the average Amazon worker is so pronounced and so obvious that it becomes farcical when he says we're all just workers and we're all just in it together, right? Like, we're talking about somebody who's richer than the richest king who ever lived, more powerful than any king who ever lived, way more powerful than Louis XIV is a modern tech CEO. It's not even close. But, you know, the reason why I say it's maybe not worth exploring whether this has truly, quote-unquote, changed or not from the era of Louis XIV to Nietzsche's age, and maybe from Nietzsche's age to our age, because it's unclear to me that this is like a universal statement. Like, some people this does work on, it seems. Some people do actually think the corporate bosses are with them, that they are the same in some way. And so, to me, it's indeterminate, the degree to which people are willing to view those sorts of proclamations as cynical and the people who are actually taken in by them. But I think, you know, however we want to look at it, Nietzsche gives us some food for thought here. Let's go to 189, quote, "The thinker, he is a thinker. That means he knows how to make things simpler than they are," end quote. And, you know, I would say this is the mark of a great philosopher, if he can say in one sentence what other men say in whole paragraphs or even in whole books, if he can take complex ideas and distill them down. And I'm not going to say I'm a great thinker myself. I'm just going to say what a lot of people enjoy about my podcast is precisely the fact that I don't try to complicate things. I try to take things and make them simple and straightforward. I try and put it into a language that anyone can understand if they're willing to go with me and think all of this through to the end and understand why somebody holds the views that they do, not just stating the views that they have, and not trying to do these shibboleths, not trying to do these philosophical diction or jargon, making reference all the time to all these different thinkers. And it all just sort of becomes like a test for whether or not you're in the club. Do you comprehend what I'm saying when I'm giving this discourse on Marxism and I start talking about Althusser and Marcuse and all these people and just making reference to all their ideas without bothering to explicate any of that? Some people, they want to be in that club. That's what they're doing, but that's not thinking. That in some sense, what thinking is to be able to constellate, being able to take all of this knowledge and put it together and distill it down, to be able to summarize and say, essentially, this whole essay is about this, and put it into a sentence. That's what proves that you've done the thinking. And so, yeah, I think Nietzsche's dead on here. 190, quote, "Against those who praise. A says, one is praised only by one's peers. B says, yes, and whoever praises you says, I am your peer," end quote. And I think this also applies to criticism. We might recall Nietzsche's rule of thumb that he attacks victorious causes and that his attacking a cause is a way of affording it praise or a way of affording it merit. So any merited attention of having to make any comment at all about what someone has said. I mean, Nietzsche says he would rather remain silent. He would rather say nothing at all. So if he says anything at all, that is in some way a form of praise. But even let's just think about explicit outward praise. If I say, wow, you really did a good job on that. You really nailed your interpretation of Nietzsche there. I'm necessarily putting myself in a position to evaluate how good a job you did, which means at least I'm your peer, right? I mean, in fact, oftentimes when we praise people, or when you receive praise, say in the educational system from a teacher, you're actually receiving it from someone above you who is actually not your peer. Now, I don't think this is problematic for the aphorism, because it's clear to me that what Nietzsche is, the way he's talking about peership here is as a way of, by praising, you elevate yourself to the level that that person is at by praising them. And so it's no contradiction to say praise could also come from above, right? But there is something about that, to express your admiration in a way to someone that presumes that they care that you admire them, is to put yourself at least on par with them, if not above them. And I think there's something to this that Nietzsche is saying. Let's go to 191. Quote, "Against many a defense, the most perfidious way of harming a cause consists of defending it deliberately with faulty arguments," end quote. And, I mean, this is why people online will often say, that person who advocates for that political cause, like, we'll just use the left and the right, that leftist YouTuber must be a right-wing plant, because their arguments are so bad. The things they say are just going to lead people to the right wing. And so the best, it's like when people say in team sports, he's our team. When they look at the worst player on the other team and they say he's our team's best player, right? And there is something about that, and it's not just faulty arguments. It's like when people just make embarrassing or terrible arguments sometimes that you just wonder, it stands to wonder, could someone actually who really cares and advocates for this cause actually make that argument, or must they be secretly an enemy of that cause, right? And so there's really not much more to say about this, but it's titled, the aphorism is entitled, "Against Many a Defense." And so really the point would be, there are many defenses or potential defenses of your position that you should not make, because it would actually be better to just remain silent than to make that defense. And oftentimes, people can't help themselves. Let's go to 192. Quote, "The good-natured. What is the difference between those good-natured people whose faces radiate goodwill and other people? They are cheered by the sight of another person and quickly fall in love with him. Therefore, they are well disposed toward him, and their first judgment is, 'I like him.' What distinguishes these people is a rapid succession of the following states: the wish to appropriate. They do not scruple over the worth of the other person. Quick appropriation, delight in their new possession, and action for the benefit of their latest conquest." End quote. So again, Nietzsche has not used the term will to power yet, but this is a wonderful description of good-naturedness as will to power. That, and Nietzsche has brought up this whole concept before of selfishness as the root of selflessness, or of something like the desire to hurt at the root of pity. And here we have the desire to appropriate, to sort of collect people, as the root of good-naturedness, right? So you say, "I like him. I'm going to make him one of my friends. He's going to be one of the people that are well disposed towards me because I'm well disposed towards him." And Nietzsche presents this in this aphorism as a kind of conquest and a kind of collection of people. And I'm not going to say that I see all good-naturedness in this light as Nietzsche does. I think he might make a, again, if we are treating the world strictly as will to power, it's kind of necessary that we find these explanations for all of the aspects of human life that seemingly have nothing to do with will to power. But I will say, I have known people who are definitely like this, who definitely do seem to collect friends, who do get a sense of power from having appropriated all of these personalities to themselves, to sort of have their pick of the people that they're well disposed to, the people that they like, and surround themselves with sort of their own little clique or something like that, being the leader of the pack or something like that. Very common in social situations. Very La Rochefoucaudian insight from Nietzsche. So, and I would just simply say, maybe to clarify, in that I think there might be forms of good-naturedness that do not conform to this whole pattern. I wouldn't necessarily say that these other forms of good-naturedness can't be explained by will to power. But I just think maybe not everyone's trying to sort of appropriate and collect other people. There might be other reasons. And we'll leave it at that because it takes us beyond the scope of the aphorism. So let's go to 193, one of the best aphorisms here. Quote, "Kant's joke. Kant wanted to prove, in a way that would dumbfound the common man, that the common man was right." That was the secret joke of his soul. He wrote against the scholars in support of popular prejudice, but for scholars and not for the people." End quote. So Kant attempts to salvage all of the things that basically had been lost with the downfall of metaphysics, the problem to the theories of knowledge that had been raised in the wake of the disputations between rationalists and empiricists, and finally culminating in the skepticism of Hume, who thinks essentially we can't know anything. And Kant comes in, he critiques knowledge, but by critiquing knowledge, by showing us what knowledge really is, showing us what it can't do, he shows us what it can do. It can give us knowledge of the phenomenal world, what we know is the phenomenal world. All of those conditions of knowing things in the phenomenal world, like the law of induction, cause and effect, and so on, they're not discovered through induction. They're not discovered in the phenomenal world. We know them a priori. We know them inherently so that we can cognize the phenomenal world at all. And I want to read, and then of course, before getting onto this, Kant also produces the categorical imperative. So David Hume had reduced morality to a series of preferences, essentially, likes and dislikes of the general will, the common people. And Kant says, no, morality actually is deontological. It actually is a duty, and that is a fact about human existence, that you have moral duties. You have obligations, that you have to act in a certain way. And by separating thing in itself and appearance, Kant also leaves this world beyond the boundaries of human cognition or perception. So the thing in itself becomes this thing that we acknowledge but do not directly know. And so now I want to read Kaufmann's footnote on this section. Quote, "The reference is surely to Kant's postulates of God, freedom of the will, and immortality of the soul, and to the elaborate and difficult distinction between phenomena and noumena that, in Kant's own words, quote, makes room for faith," end quote. So what Kant does by salvaging all of these things from the project of Western philosophy, what does he salvage? In Nietzsche's view, he salvages the popular prejudices. He salvages the idea that we can know the world, and yet he leaves room for a world beyond that perhaps might be the domain of God or something like that. He makes an argument for free will. Kant says we think of ourselves as beings with free will, therefore we must act as if we have free will. So he sort of circumvents the question of determinism. And he provides us with a facticity of morality, a series of moral facts, a series of duties and obligations, which probably accords with how most of the populace saw morality, given that they believed in sort of like divine command theory, right? You have these duties and obligations from on high. Kant simply replicates this in a logical fashion rather than a theological fashion. And so Kant, with Kant's philosophy, all of the popular prejudices of religion that would seem to be under threat from the Enlightenment project, which culminates in skepticism with David Hume, all of that returns at a gallop with Kant's philosophy. And yet, the common folk, the German Volk, the salt of the earth people, they don't understand Kant's philosophy. They can't read his books. Have you ever tried to pick up one of Kant's books? Try reading Critique of Pure Reason and then tell me if you think a German peasant from the 1700s could have understood that book. I mean, the average person today has far more access to the ability to become literate, for one. I mean, the fact that we have like a public schooling system that attempts at least to make everyone literate. I think last I checked, most Americans read at a third grade level, but at least they have the resources there. And you have the resources online where pretty much every work in the public domain can be found for free. So basically all the greatest literature that's ever been written is available to you at the touch of your fingertips for free. And how many people still in the modern age could pick up a book by Kant and read and understand it? How many people would even have the motivation to apply themselves to that task? And so Kant, his philosophy is not for the common people, but the metaphysics that his philosophy arrives at and the morality is for the common people. It's exactly the same thing. And that's actually profound in itself. So That's funny in one way. That's Kant's joke, as Nietzsche puts it. But also, what effect does this have? It has the effect of sort of mystifying things in the popular consciousness, right? The average person can sort of say, like, well, didn't Kant prove that, there are moral facts, Well, I don't understand the arguments. I haven't read it, but I'm sure this expert philosopher has proved it all for me. Is that really any different than the priests who were the only ones who could read Latin, who became the authorities for interpreting the Bible, right? Making the philosopher a new kind of priest who discerns reality for the common person, who can't read his philosophical tome. It's totally beyond them. But it affirms all their prejudices, so why question it? And it is pretty funny, I have to say, that Kant's entire philosophy does simply recapitulate itself to everything the common people believe, but in a way they could never understand. Kant's joke. Hilarious. All right, let's move on. Let's go to 194, quote, "The open-hearted. That person probably always acts in accordance with secret reasons, for he always has communicable reasons on his lips and practically in his open hand." End quote. So, and Nietzsche puts open-hearted in quotation marks as well here. So that implies whoever is so willing to be so open about the reasons for their behavior, so vulnerable, right, is often hiding something. And I find this to be absolutely true. And one of the things, it's not precisely what Nietzsche talks about, but think about this. If somebody has an excuse for why they can't come to something, and they give you the reasons why they can't come, it's a sure sign. Well, maybe not a sure sign. You can never really know if someone's lying. But usually when somebody gives you multiple reasons, it's like, oh, I was sick and my car wasn't working. And I also had my mother was visiting and all of these things. I just couldn't make it. I mean, sometimes stuff like that really does happen. I don't want you to go around being paranoid about your friends lying to you. But usually there's actually one reason why people don't want to come. Usually it's the reason they just don't want to come. But if somebody has a dinner date with you or something and they don't make it, there's usually like one reason why they don't make it. When somebody starts piling on reasons, it's almost like it's a sign or an indication that they're trying to cover up. They're trying to consciously lie to you. Now, again, I said that's not precisely what Nietzsche's talking about here. Really what I think he's talking about is actually people who may consciously actually think that the reason that they give you for why they do something, when they always have a reason, perhaps they consciously do think that that is the reason. But there's something about that kind of person, like with the mind, because the way Nietzsche thinks about the human psychology is that the reasons for why we do things have that pre-rational unconscious origin, and that the mind is providing post hoc rationalizations. So the person who's always freely giving their conscious post hoc rationalizations for what they did, who's always making their behavior sound as if it conforms to prudence or morality or just good sense or something, and just always has a good reason for everything that they do, you should be suspicious of that, like funnily enough. Or just don't be taken in by such a person, because it almost certainly hides some sort of secret motive that they might not even be aware of. Okay, let's go to 195, quote, "Laughable. Look, he is running away from people, but they follow after him because he's running ahead of them. They are heard through and through," end quote. And I mean, I think this applies to Nietzsche himself, right? The people who will ape Nietzsche, the people who will follow after him as though he's a saint. He says, you should go your own way. I don't, here's my way, but where is yours? I don't want to be a saint. I'd rather be a clown. And so he runs away from people. But look how we have all followed after Nietzsche. And this is sort of an eternal problem with Nietzsche's philosophy, right? Is he preaches to the people who are not of the herd, and he always, whenever you have an effective preachment, you always gather a herd around yourself. Okay, let's go to 196, quote, "Limits of our hearing. One hears only those questions for which one is able to find answers," end quote. And I think this is especially true in philosophy. We so often reason towards an answer which we have already found, and the questions that we set up are there to lead us to the answer. It is very rare that an inquiry actually begins from a question and leads to a definite answer. Usually when there's a genuine question driving your inquiry, that represents a sort of conflict within yourself. And those, I'll use myself as an example in my book. When I'm trying to determine what is art, what is the artistic activity, that was driven by a very real conflict within myself. It was a genuine question because I did not know the answer, not because I was like driving towards an answer that I already knew, quote unquote, or had to impose on the world, but rather I felt this deep divide between the impracticality of art, the fact that it doesn't seem to be for anything, doesn't seem to be useful for anything, and yet my need, my necessity, my drive to do it. And so how can I make sense of this? And perhaps the biggest flaw in my book is that I did come to an answer, that I do attempt to answer the question, because I think there's something valuable in when you have a genuine question based on a genuine divide within yourself, a genuine coming to odds of your own drives. There's something about that. There's something about sitting within that and letting that irreconcilability sit within you that I think is very valuable. And so, really what Nietzsche's saying here, it's not really a criticism. It's just getting us to think about question and answer in a different way. The answer is not that which concludes the inquiry that began with the question. Oftentimes the inquiry begins with the answer, and we ask the questions for which we are suited to find answers. There is a sort of like a relationship. It's not a chronology where you start with the question, you go to the answer. You ask those questions which lead to the answers, which you already knew in some sense. Okay, let's go to 197, quote, "Better watch out. There is nothing we like so much to communicate to others as the seal of secrecy, along with what lies under it," end quote. So the fact that this one's called Better Watch Out tells us what Nietzsche's aim is here. Whenever somebody presents to you, hey, this knowledge is secret, you can't tell anyone about it, or that the average people aren't going to get it, that's very enticing. It's very intriguing. You could say it's the basis of all cults. You could say that that's the way that, Nietzsche was certainly very familiar with the Pythagoreans and with the Orphics. That's how they operated, and there are plenty such cults today. And in a way, you could say Nietzsche tries to steal some of that power for himself. That, look, the average people don't have the right to these ideas. These are elite ideas that only us free spirits really have a right to. That's a large part of the appeal of Nietzsche's philosophy. Let's go to 198, quote, "Chagrin of the proud. The proud feel chagrined even by those who advance them. They are angry with the horses of their carriage," end quote. And to use another example from Greek antiquity, this makes me think of Empedocles, who was a philosopher. He's a pre-Socratic philosopher, but he has that Greek competitive spirit. He's incredibly proud, and he sets himself in opposition to, Nietzsche says he has jealousy, intense burning jealousy towards all the philosophers who came before him. But aren't all the philosophers who came before him necessary for Empedocles' philosophy? Empedocles arises among the pluralists. He arises in this part of the philosophical zeitgeist where they're beginning to address themselves to the question, what exists, being, what is matter, what is physis, what is the world, in a way that doesn't just reduce everything down to one thing, and yet retains that sort of sense of being or endurance that we might today in scientific terms call it the law of conservation of matter or of mass and energy. And so Empedocles, and that's required that the Eleatics came. And it was also required that the first cosmologists, people like Thales and Heraclitus, did their philosophy where they tried to make everything one. And then the Eleatics come and they say, well, if everything's one, then it's all being, which means it's unchanging and there's no motion, there's no time. And then Anaxagoras comes along and he says, well, no, so there isn't just one thing. There are fundamentally all sorts, the original state of being is a chaos. It's every type of element contains every other type of element. It's all mingled together, but it's all being. The physical world is being. It's not that all of the senses, all of the world is appertained by the senses or apprehended by the senses is just completely false. all of these things are being, they are enduring. It's not just becoming and passing away. And in fact, things don't become and pass away. We have reconfigurations of matter. It's actually very similar to the way a modern-day scientist would think about things. Well, Empedocles comes as part of that zeitgeist, right? He's the one who gives us the theory, put theories in quotes, of the four elements, but like that kind of world picture. He is in the pluralist milieu, and yet he feels intense, almost like domineering jealousy towards all other philosophers who came before. He resents their greatness. Nietzsche says he was a very competitive man. He was very Greek in that way. He attained the highest honor at the Olympiad. So he brings that same competitive spirit to philosophy and sort of thinks, I'm going to outdo all of these previous philosophers. None of them deserve the fame they have. I'm going to be the most famous one, because he's regally prideful as well. He believes he's a god incarnate on earth. But in spite of the fact that he has all these magical, mystical beliefs about himself, he is still pulled forward by the accomplishments of others who came before him, but he even resents them, right? So in that way, the proud man feels chagrined even by those who advance them. They're angry with the horses of their carriage, the horses that pulled him forward. And we could even say this could apply on a far more everyday level than someone like Empedocles. We could say that somebody, again, a self-made man, a titan of industry, might really resent it. Let's look at Steve Jobs and what was the guy's name? Steve Wozniak, I think was his name. The guy who actually designed a lot of the technology that made Apple what it is. Who's Steve Jobs? He's like a PR guy. But Steve Jobs is known for having like a massive ego, right? For considering himself like just this God's gift to, the world of technology. When in fact, Steve Wozniak was God's gift to the world of technology. And the image presented by Apple and the legacy of Steve Jobs as this one of greatness and sort of the minimization of the guy who actually built the technology. You could also look at like Stan Lee and what was his name? Kirby. I forget the guy's. Jack Kirby, I think was his name. It was the guy who like drew all the comic books, and Stan Lee was like the idea guy, right? There's so often there's the proud sort of idea guy. I just come in and have the ideas, and you guys figure out how to do it, right? And so they always, those are the horses pulling ahead their carriage, and they always sort of, they deal with that chagrin by minimizing or making them, a less important part of the legacy overall. It's a very common thing. Okay, let's go to 200. Quote, laughter means being schadenfroh, but with a good conscience, end quote. Of course, schadenfreude is that untranslatable German term of taking pleasure in someone's suffering. It's not sadism precisely. That's why it's hard to translate, because you wouldn't have schadenfreude about somebody like, getting tortured to death or something. You wouldn't have schadenfreude about somebody being killed at all. It's more like the kind of enjoyment you get out of slapstick comedy or, watching an episode of Seinfeld or something like that, where the characters fail or get themselves into some sort of silly but painful situation for the main character. And we enjoy it. So laughter means being schadenfroh, but with a good conscience. So taking pleasure in sort of the, what might we say, the absurdity and the travails of existence, but with a good conscience, without having any guilt about it, right? Being able to laugh at the absurdity, the comedy of existence without guilt, at least in that moment. Let's go to 201. Quote, applause. In applause, there is always a kind of noise, even when we applaud ourselves, end quote. I don't really have much of a comment on this one. I mean, I think the sense in which Nietzsche is talking about noise, he means like the noise of the crowd, sort of like just chattering, cheering, clapping. And this is even true when we applaud ourselves, when we give praise to our own efforts. There's something of maybe perhaps the hoi polloi in that tendency. Let's go to 202. Quote, a squanderer, and yet he does not have the poverty of the rich who have already counted all their treasures once. He is squandering his spirit with the unreason of squandering nature, end quote. So, I mean, this is a common refrain from Nietzsche, that nature is a squanderer, that the riches, the abundance of nature is continually wasted. We might think of just speciation and how many forms of life have to perish, how many have perished, the abattoir of nature, and the fact that it is just so wasteful. And so Nietzsche says, he talks about a squanderer, as yet he does not have the poverty of the rich. So initially, he's talking about somebody who is squandering his spirit with the unreason of squandering nature, implying that there's a kind of rich poverty that might perhaps be a squandering with reasons. And this refers us back to that idea of becoming voluntarily poor or a voluntary beggar. And again, you should see that passage in Thus Spoke Zarathustra to really comprehend this. But I think there's quite a bit about wealth and poverty and spending in these aphorisms. And yet Nietzsche is often talking not about physical wealth, but about spirit. It's just that the metaphor of physical wealth can be very useful for understanding exactly what he's talking about. Let's go to 203, quote, "Hic niger est. Usually he has no thought in his head, but in exceptional cases he has nasty thoughts," end quote. And that quote means here he is black. Black obviously being used in the sense of bleak, melancholic, dark, as we would say. And so Nietzsche describes a person who usually has no thought in his head, but when he does, in the exceptional case that he does, he has nasty thoughts, melancholic thoughts, perhaps anxious or depressed thoughts, to use the modern language of psychology. And this is a type of person, right? That I've known people like this, where they don't seem self-reflective at all. They don't seem interested in deep ideas at all, except that it's because whenever they touch depth with their mind, it plunges them into this existential abyss, and so they just prefer not to think about it. So I think that's what Nietzsche is talking about here. It's a very sad story. Let's go to 204, quote, "Beggars and courtesy. There is no lack of courtesy in using a stone to knock on a door when there is no bell. That is how beggars feel, and all who suffer some sort of distress. But nobody agrees with them," end quote. This is interesting because we might say in moments of great need or distress, people feel like they can circumvent what we might call the proper channels or something like that. Like maybe if I need help, like if I need to borrow some money from a friend, I might call them up and say, "Hey, can I talk to you? Hey, can I take you out to lunch? I need a loan. This is like, I'm good for it. I'll pay you back, but I'm really in hard times right now. Maybe I have medical debt or something. And as a friend, can you do this for me, right? But let's say I need money because, just use like a silly example. I got to pay the mob back by 12 p.m. today. And if I don't, they're going to break my fingers, right? So then I'm not going to call my friend and be like, "Oh, let's sit down and have a lunch and maybe discuss the possibility of you giving me a loan." I'm going to show up at your house unannounced, bang on the door and be like, "I need $1,000 right now." So, something like that. And, again, this is a very silly or vulgar example. The point is, when somebody is a beggar or in dire need, and this could apply to literal beggars, it's usually considered improper or bad manners to stand on the street with a sign asking for money. But if you're homeless, people say, "Well, I'm taking the only measures available to me," right? And if I really need something from a friend, I'm going to break all those protocols of like friendship or etiquette to say, I really need something. And so this is analogized to, well, there's no bell to ring on the door. I'm just going to pick up a rock and beat on the door until you answer it. And Nietzsche says, they excuse this behavior because it's a necessity. I need this. But nobody agrees with them. That deep down, we all still resent it, right? And there is something about that I think especially many liberals don't like to admit. There's something that many people resent about seeing a beggar there, right? That however much you might have internalized a whole leftist narrative about people, the conditions of society, the material conditions, the way they were raised, and lack of education or resources for the community or whatever, and that's what creates homelessness. And if we only, invested a few tens of billions of dollars, we could just give them all homes and remedy this problem and this, this poor man. I think there is something psychologically that many people will still experience when they see the beggar standing there thinking, who is he to be asking me for money? I work for a living. Especially the people, I would say, a lot of the antipathy towards what Marx would call the Lumpenproletariat comes from the proletariat, from the wage workers who have the least disposable income to just give to people, and then they look at someone just asking them for some of their income, and they're going to think, like, how dare you, And of course, the beggar's not asking you directly. He's just standing there holding a sign. But there is a tinge, and I've seen this in people's behavior with how they respond to beggars. And I'm around them more often than most people because I'm a musician and a touring musician, and that often takes you into the downtown of a given area, and there's usually beggars around. And, every tour you'll interact with some of them, and they'll come up and ask you for something. And as a touring musician, I don't have a lot of disposable income myself, and you politely tell them no. But you can see certain people, especially the people at the venues who have to deal with the same beggars over and over again, and how they just get frustrated and are like, just no, get out of here, right? And I think that's a real psychological dynamic. So there's no lack of courtesy in using a stone to knock on a door when there is no bell. In fact, there is a lack of courtesy, and most people feel that in spite of whatever necessities that person may have. And that's just the reality of human nature. In spite of whatever rational explanations, there are certain feelings or just the ways that people are going to tend to feel about things that are pretty rational. Let's go to 205, quote, Need is considered the cause why something came to be, but in truth it is often merely an effect of what has come to be, end quote. Nietzsche makes that distinction, I believe, in genealogy between the origin and the function, and points out that oftentimes we look to the origin to understand the function when in fact they have changed. And so the reason why we need something now is not necessarily the reason why it came to be. The need that something is fulfilling, whether it be a social institution or a moral value or whatever, doesn't necessarily have to do with the origin. Let's go to 206, quote, When it rains, it is raining, and I think of the poor who now huddle together with their many cares and without any practice at concealing these. Each is ready and willing to hurt the other and to create for himself a wretched kind of pleasure even when the weather is bad. That, and only that, is the poverty of the poor. End quote. So notice that Nietzsche has counterposed the poverty of the rich with the poverty of the poor. That the poverty of the rich sort of springs out of this desire to depend on nothing. It may even be generosity, right? To give everything away, but it's to give everything away for a self-centered reason, for independence, something like that. And the poverty of the poor here is described in terms, I believe Robert Michels used the term ergomachia, the struggle for the feeding ground in political parties. I've tried to find any other source for that term, and I haven't been able to find it. So we'll just use the struggle for the feeding ground. That's what Nietzsche is describing here. And the fact that in the struggle for the feeding ground, that is an outlet for the will to power. And so I spoke just a moment ago about the wage proletarian looking down upon the lumpen proletarian. That's a very real thing. Giving the people, even at the lower rungs of society, the ability to punch down is a really important thing for social cohesion. That totally flies in the face of all of our modern humanitarian notions, but that's one of the few pleasures or fulfillments available to someone who is in a state of poverty. The poverty of the poor, not the rich, right? Is the struggle for a dry spot under the stoop when it's raining, and the ability to shove someone else out so that you can have your spot. At least then you experience strength in some way. And that's a very ugly thing. But again, I think that is part of human nature. And we see it again and again. Let's go to 207, quote, The envious. He is envious. Let us hope that he will not have children, for he would envy them because he cannot be a child anymore, end quote. And I have little comment on this one as well. I think it's all there on the face of it. there are people who, I don't know if it comes out of envy, but people who definitely want to remain perpetual children. And I guess, yeah, they would look at their children as taking away from them the ability to be a child still. And we have a popular prejudice in modern times that once you have children, it changes you, right? A change comes over you, and that child's now the most important thing. And certainly this happens to many people. There are also people who are completely neglectful of their children, or abuse their children, or do not have that attitude towards their children. There are parents who have let their baby starve while they played World of Warcraft, right? That has happened. Is that, you can say that's a pathological thing, that's not a common thing, but it's enough to simply point out that's what Nietzsche's saying. Like, occasionally there are some people that you look at them and say, that person should not have children. That is true. There are people, I've been taking the piss out of the left a lot in this reading, but there are people on the right who present that as a panacea. You just need to have children. That's the road to maturity. No, some people are actually like constitutionally immature. And having children would actually be worse because now their immaturity is imposed on the life of a helpless child, right? So not everyone, if to be a parent is to be a governor, a ruler over your household, I'm just shocked that people on the right wing who just look at like, everyone needs to have kids, everyone needs to have a traditional family. It's like, do you not accept the classical dictate that not everyone is suited to rule? It's simply the case. Not everyone's suited to rule. Not everyone is suited to be a parent because that requires that you guide the life of a child. You're responsible for the life of a child. You really think everyone should take on that responsibility? That's insane. All right, let's go to 208. Quote, great man. From the fact that somebody is a big man, we cannot infer that he is a man. Perhaps he is merely a boy, or a chameleon of all the ages of life, or a bewitched little female, end quote. A bit of a reference to sort of like fairy tales at the end there. The idea of a big man who is perhaps a little boy, or a chameleon of all the ages of life. I mean, once again, we have the idea of somebody who's like a perpetual child who may have successfully disguised themselves as having attained maturity or even greatness. But, we might think of the movie Big with Tom Hanks as an allegory, right? Of a child literally appearing as a grown adult. And again, not as much commentary on this one. I think it's fairly straightforward. The fact that someone gives off a certain appearance of greatness or being the boss or being, that doesn't actually mean that they really have. I mean, I could think of any number of public figures that, especially from recent events, who I'm not going to name the one that I'm thinking of, but who certainly gives the appearance of being a big man, and I suspect is merely a boy. All right, let's go to 209. Quote, one way of asking for reasons. There is a way of asking us for our reasons that leads us not only to forget our best reasons, but also to conceive a stubborn aversion to all reasons. This way of asking makes people very stupid and is a trick used by tyrannical people. End quote. So what is this way of asking? It's funny that Nietzsche never says what the way of asking is. He doesn't give us what would we say? 1, 2, 3 do-it-yourself instructions of how to ask people for their reasons in a way that makes them stupid and forget their reasons, and even forget, what does he say? Gives them a stubborn aversion to all reasons. And this is used by tyrannical people. I will say there was somebody who was like this on the Zen subreddit, who's an infamous user on that subreddit, who would kind of go around and interrogate people, like place himself in that position of authority, implicitly or otherwise. And he would literally tell people, you need to do an AMA and ask me anything. You need to host a thread where we can all sort of subject you to questioning. And, really it was so that he could subject them to questioning and have a sort of like public record of it. And the way of approach unhinged people. It made people basically, I saw it happen again and again on the forum where it's sort of like, I don't have to give reasons to you, I don't have to justify myself to you. And then he can turn around and say, look, he's unwilling to justify himself. Clearly he's a liar, right? And this is very surface level accounting. There's all sorts of ways. I mean, one of the things I do want to talk about in the podcast in the future is Schopenhauer's The Art of Being Right, which is a great guide to trolling. It's also, by that very nature, also a guide to recognize and counter trolling efforts. But it's sort of like how to never lose an argument, right? And this is an aspect of that. You can, in the most basic terms, to just put what Nietzsche's talking about here in the most basic terms, present yourself as a sort of authority figure and interrogate someone and put them on the defensive. And that will make them, especially if they're aware of this dynamic, be like, well, I don't want to look defensive, right? Like I had somebody, this is a silly example, but I'll give it. On Twitter, X, somebody came at me saying, totally unrelated to anything I was talking about in the thread, to say, like, why do you follow so many trans people? It's like, well, I follow maybe like, I actually went and looked. There's maybe half a dozen accounts I follow out of hundreds who I guess I know are trans or are openly trans. And they're all followed for a given reason. Like they made a point at some point that I thought was interesting, or they talked about some philosopher, or like, even somebody I don't agree with at all on almost anything, like Brianna Wu, is like still like a sort of cultural touchstone, like stands for a certain like cultural milieu, right? And I kind of want to know what all those people are thinking. So anyway, like this person just starts like, by asking me that question, they're trying to like interrogate me and put me on the defensive. If I were to say any of that in a tweet, right? Well, I don't really follow that many accounts and they're all followed for other reasons. All of a sudden I'm being defensive. And so what did that do? Well, it made me not want to give them any reasons. It made me just say, why are you being such a loser interrogating me about something that has nothing to do? Like, why does this matter? Why are you so obsessed with this issue? A weird aside in this breakdown of Nietzsche's book to go into like trans issues. But I mean, God, some of you are just obsessed with that issue, man. Like when I responded to Philosophy Tube, I'm like still getting comments on that where people, that is the sole thing that they care about is trans. They don't care about any of the content of the video. They're there to like fight a culture war about the trans thing. Which I do not care about at all, guys. I don't care about it. Either way, it doesn't affect my life. What are you guys worried about, right? It's only you culture conf like people, and it's not even culture conf on the grand scale, on the great politics scale. It's on this like micro level of picking fights over just the most trivial, stupid thing. And so that'll be my rant. My rant's over, but that was just an example of someone who actually approached me demanding I give them reasons, and it made me stubborn. It made me to say, no, I'm not going to give you my reasons, right? Like you're not an authority over me. I don't have to explain myself to you. And yet that's a technique. That putting people in that state of mind that I was in, that is an argumentative technique that people will use. Well, not argumentative. We'll say it's a manipulative propagandist technique that people use because it's useful to make your enemies appear that way. Look, he can't explain himself, right? It's bad faith. All right, let's go to 210, quote, moderation in industriousness. One should not try to excel one's father's industriousness. That makes one sick, end quote. There are a couple things I could think in regard to this, but I think about helping my father with doing sort of like stuff around the house, like handiwork, right? Help me put up these panels or help me, install new gutters or something. And if just how hard that he would work, even though he was so much older than me. My father's still around. I'm talking about it in the past tense, but we don't really collaborate on stuff like that anymore. I'm talking about more when I was younger. But I just imagine what it would have been like if I had tried to match his work ethic or like his output of work, right? Rather than just trying to be a helper, trying to be like, I'm younger and stronger, I can outdo you. for one, it's not clear that I could have outdone him. So is that the way that I could have become sick, right? That I could have exhausted myself? Or does it make one sick in that it's just a completely inappropriate sort of value to follow after, right? That trying to exceed your father, like a Confucian would look at that and be like, what's wrong with you? Okay, let's go to 211, quote, secret enemies. To be able to afford a secret enemy, that is a luxury for which the morality of even elevated spirits is usually not rich enough, end quote. So what is a secret enemy here? We might say a secret enemy in Nietzsche's work, at least according to Deleuze, is Hegel. Nietzsche, I don't think he ever mentioned, well, he did mentions him a couple times in his published work. It's never critically. And yet, you could look at Nietzsche's entire method as anti-dialectical. And here I mean dialectical in the Hegelian sense. And that this might have even been required because if you become an open enemy of Hegel, if you make your work into a negation of Hegel, suddenly the Hegelians come along and say, look, you're not actually negating Hegel, because to be negating Hegel is to be placing yourself into this relationship with Hegel, because all negation eventually leads to a sublation, right? So it's required for Nietzsche to be a secret enemy of Hegel, to treat him with a sort of silent hostility that he treated Christianity in his early work. But he says that's a luxury for which the morality of even elevated spirits is usually not rich enough. So normally, we have to make open enemies if we are going to put forward a certain moral valuation or moral system or something like that. Just by way of contrast, right? Like Nietzsche's whole project. How does he oppose Christianity and modern values? Well, by contrast to the Greeks. So I'm going to make Dionysus versus the crucified. This is an open enemy. But then you might say, well, he has secret enemies as well. There are people that Nietzsche is responding to that usually moralists are not rich enough to have these secret antipathies in their work, because it's enough, like it requires enough of them just to adumbrate their open morality. They don't have enough richness, enough complexity to really warrant secret enemies, undercurrents of their thought that even might go unmentioned, but are very illuminating if we know the secret enemy. Let's go to 212, quote, not to be deceived. His spirit has bad manners, is hasty, and so impatient that it always stutters. Hence one scarcely suspects how long the breath and how broad the chest of the soul are in which this spirit is at home. End quote. Again, I don't have much commentary here. I mean, really just Nietzsche's drawing attention to one's outward manner and the way that this relates to their inner state. And so one scarcely suspects how long the breath and how broad the chest of the soul are in which the spirit is at home. So just like there's bad manners everywhere. There's impatience, stuttering, hastiness all around us. And somebody who's truly at home within their own soul, we underestimate exactly just how much more hesitating rather than hasty, how much more prudent and patient you really have to be at home within your own soul, because it's something we don't experience. Let's go to 213. Quote, the way to happiness. A sage asked a fool about the way to happiness. The fool answered instantly as if he had merely been asked about the way to the nearest town. Admire yourself and live in the street. No, replied the sage, you are asking too much. It is quite sufficient to admire oneself. The fool shot back, but how can one constantly admire without constantly feeling contempt? End quote. This is one of those wonderful passages where it's not exactly clear, are we supposed to identify Nietzsche's opinion with the sage or with the fool? Well, they both have some merit to their position. They both perhaps are tendencies within Nietzsche himself. So there's wisdom in both viewpoints, but which one triumphs? Well, the fool answers instantly. So he's a fool. He's like, think about Parsifal, just sort of like a naive wild man who doesn't have any sophistication. He doesn't have any erudition or education. He's just a simple man. He answers as if he's merely being asked about the way to the nearest town. Admire yourself and live in the street. Why? Well, have self-esteem, and you will esteem yourself by contrasting yourself with others. And this will become very important in the genealogy of the pleasure of knowing oneself different, the evaluating glance of the nobility that doesn't look outward in order to condemn what is outside the self, but simply to know oneself more completely as something good. Good, self-directed good, self-legislating good, I am good. That is the primary concern of the master morality. And we might say the master morality is foolish, it's naive, it's not sophisticated. It occurs during the childhood of humanity is when this is the predominant moral orientation. And so that type of evaluating glance only looks outward as a self-confirmation. And that's sort of what Nietzsche is describing here. But the sage is saying it's quite sufficient to admire yourself. And there is merit in that too, insofar as where one cannot love, one should pass by. Nietzsche says that in some sense, having to live in the street, having to make those comparisons, living in the age of comparisons, there's something about that places you in a reactive relationship inherently. Like, you shouldn't have to depend on the evaluating glance outward in order for your self-admiration to occur. You shouldn't need to, because that can become a very, again, nasty and reactive thing to constantly look at. I mean, you can say this happens a lot on social media. It's like whole subreddits are based on this. The idea that, look at, like this person who's a complete asshole or has completely wrecked his life. I am so glad I'm not that person. And oftentimes the people who have to have that public-facing orientation in order to esteem their own lives have pretty sorry lives. So it should remain only an afterthought, right? But I guess so which one triumphs? I would say ultimately the fool triumphs. I would say that is the wisdom that I think Nietzsche is more akin to, that evaluating glance outward as a way of redirecting towards the self-worth of the individual. But there is something to what the sage is saying. Like you shouldn't be, that I think Nietzsche also, I guess it's not clear which one triumphs, because Nietzsche says to go into solitude, right? So Nietzsche doesn't live in the street. Nietzsche's not public-facing. Nietzsche doesn't want to constantly look at the different types of people in the marketplace just so he can esteem himself. But he's not a sage in the sense of being a religious hermit that retreats from the world either. So, I'll leave you to think about all that. We'll move on. 214, quote, "Faith makes blessed. Virtue bestows happiness and a kind of bliss only on those who have not lost their faith in their virtue, not on those subtler souls whose virtue consists in a profound mistrust of themselves and of all virtue. Ultimately, then, faith makes blessed. Here, too, and not, mark it well, virtue." End quote. So some other passages to think about here, from the Gay Science, actually. The moral skepticism of Christianity is the thing that ultimately impugns the faith and leads to its downfall. What was the moral skepticism of Christianity? Well, it was a more sophisticated version or a more sophisticated understanding of virtue than the ancients had. The ancients actually believed people could be virtuous, that you could have the good life through virtue. And that, so that when we read their books like Epictetus and Cicero, they appear childish almost to us because we have been trained by the moral skepticism of Christianity that says no man's virtuous. We can always go in and find the flaw. We can always go in and say, oh, that appeared to be a virtue, but actually there was a vice underneath it. That's largely Nietzsche's method, isn't it? That's precisely the thing, though, that he says Christianity fostered. It fostered the ability to see sin, to see vice in everyone, where virtue was proclaimed outwardly. And when this becomes all-encompassing, we even turn that against the faith itself. What Nietzsche's pointing to here is how that Christian promise that faith makes you blessed, that is the only thing that Christianity can lean on to inspire some sort of like happiness or contentment with one's life and with one's self, to avoid being constantly ashamed of oneself, is the faith in one's salvation. Because if one leans on virtue, they're going to have a profound mistrust of themselves and all virtue because of the effect of Christianity on the mind. It's not going to work. Virtue bestows happiness and a kind of bliss only on those who have not lost their faith in virtue, which we have in the modern age, which is why we need faith. Faith in faith, right? Not faith in virtue. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Let's go to 215. Quote, ideal and material. The ideal you envisage is noble, but are you a noble enough stone to be made into such a divine image? Anyway, is your work not that of a barbarous sculptor? Is it not a blasphemy against your ideal? End quote. So Nietzsche regards the self-transformative process as an artistic process, and he regards it here in this aphorism, both from the perspective of the artist and from the raw material, both of which are you, right? The self is, of course, a multiplicitous thing for Nietzsche, but you are both the artist and the work of art. And so he raises the question, well, are you not a barbarous sculptor? Are you actually a true master aesthetician sculptor in the Greek style? Are you a noble enough piece of stone to be turned into it? Like on the raw material side, on the work of art side, are you worthy of being turned into your own ideal? And so in a way, this is like Nietzsche's fatalism. You will become who you are, or you wish, it's sort of just a non-treaty, become who you are, almost like an imperative. And it's actually an imperative because we can't help but do it. You know, it's not an imperative in the sense that we could do otherwise. It's an imperative that you will become who you are. So that's why I phrase it that way. But, you know, oftentimes the way that someone becomes what they are, and this is how Nietzsche might describe a botched or badly turned out type of individual, is that they hold an ideal before themselves that they are incapable of meeting, either because they don't have the raw material within themselves or they're just too poor of an artist to do it. And in a way, perhaps you could avoid that fate. We could say this was your fate all along, was to avoid what was your apparent fate, right? But we'll leave that silliness aside. You could avoid that fate by perhaps setting an ideal for yourself, which is appropriate to a barbarous sculptor such as yourself. Let's go to 216. Quote, danger in the voice. Anyone with a very loud voice is almost incapable of thinking subtleties, end quote. This is just very funny because I remember the way Carl Jung describes Zarathustra, that because nobody listened to Nietzsche, he banged on the door even harder. He announced himself even more loudly, and it shocked and terrified everyone. So actually, Carl Jung makes this very critique on Nietzsche, that the subtleties in his thought were lost by the extremism of his style in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. But perhaps that's a good example of danger in the voice, right? Let's go to 217, quote, cause and effect. Before the effect, one believes in very different causes than one does afterward, end quote. And I'm not going to say as much about this one, not because there's not a whole lot to say, but because there's almost too much to say. This leads into Nietzsche's entire critique on causality, that what we determine as causes, like we think of cause and effect as moving chronologically from, like, say, the past into the present moment or something like that. There were all these causes that led you to be where you are right now. But we don't actually see those causes for the effects that they create as they're happening. And oftentimes we believe that there will be a completely different effect than the cause might create. But Nietzsche's not just simply speaking to the idea that we might be misinformed or not fully knowledgeable about what our actions will cause, right? I mean, that's obvious, but really what he's saying is that we always have to stand at the point that we are at and calculate backward in order to determine what the causes were, to determine this chain of causality. The chain of causality is always a retrospective glance that we only make with the foreknowledge, quote unquote, basically the knowledge of what has already occurred in the present moment, of what the effect has already been. And then we feel like we've explained something by saying what the causes were. When in fact, what would really be explanatory is if you were able to see the effect before it happens. And we could say that's science in a way, predictive power. But it's so often the case that even in our scientific hypotheses, we're still often engaged in this retrospective glance that determines the meaning after the fact. Let's go to 218, quote, "My antipathy, I do not love people who have to explode like bombs in order to have any effect at all. When one is near them, one is always in danger of suddenly losing one's hearing, if not more than that," end quote. I think this point has been already sort of made. It's a variation on a theme that Nietzsche's been making throughout this passage of noise as a very the opposite of subtlety, or it's like standing for haste or the chatter of the hoi polloi, and I think here we can take it very literally. I mean, I do not love people who have to explode like bombs in order to have any effect at all. He might be speaking quite literally of someone who has to, I remember Robert Solomon talked about this in his lectures on the passions, on the emotions, where he talked about this one, it was I forget what the context was. I think it was business meeting, like a boardroom meeting, where there was one guy who, when somebody would challenge him, he would stand up and place his palms on the table and stare that person down and get red in the face and become very angry, and use this to shut down potential criticism or discussion. And that this was sort of the only trick in this guy's book, was to control the direction of the meeting through anger. And in the modern world, it sounds a bit archaic, right? It's almost it's a kind of vision of the businessman that seems to have died with the 1980s, that isn't really reflected these days. But sort of there are some people who have that's the only trick they have, is to become loud, to become obtrusive, something like that. And they have no effect at all otherwise, quote unquote. So I think Nietzsche might be speaking somewhat literally. 219, quote, "The purpose of punishment. The purpose of punishment is to improve those who punish. That is the last resort of the apologists for punishment," end quote. And this one, I have to admit, is a bit of a mystery to me. I mean, I know that I could spin out an argument for it, but I don't believe that argument, because I don't personally see that people make this argument for punishment. They often, I think what Nietzsche is alluding to here without saying it, is that people often justify punishment by saying it's to improve those who are punished, right? We're going to rehabilitate them. We're going to, if not that, beat the evil out of them, we're going to deter them. So deterrence might say, the purpose of punishment is to improve all those who are not punished, but who might think of that punishment being visited against them. And rehabilitation is to improve those who are punished. I guess the only argument I can really make for punishment being improving those who punish is that through retribution, the punisher is sort of become better. But usually it's not the person who's doing the punishing that retribution is said to, quote unquote, improve, right? Usually it's this is for the sake of the family. This is for them to get justice, that we execute a murderer. It's not that the person who does the execution is made better. And in fact, going all the way back to the Middle Ages, there was a lot of stigma around being an executioner. They were kind of afforded a sort of dignity and respect, kind of an awe, ooh, that's a scary man. Don't touch the executioner even. He's even kind of untouchable, but in a way that he has kind of an aura about him. And even then into the modern day, the old thing about firing squads, about we're not going to put bullets in all the guns. Who knows who actually killed him, right? So even though you would think there'd be plenty of people, especially in America, who'd be more than willing to take their rifle and shoot a convicted murderer or a rapist or someone, we still had that convention for a very long time that we don't, we're going to conceal who the real executioner is, because it tarnishes you in some way to be the executioner. You've broken the first commandment, thou shalt not kill. Actually, that's not the first commandment. The first commandment is, thou shalt have no other gods before me. I don't remember which commandment it is, that thou shalt not kill. It was never a very important commandment to the Christians, am I right? But anyway, at least on some moral level, it's I guess I'm saying I don't hear that argument as the last resort of the people who argue for punishment. So, but another, maybe a more interesting thing is the undercurrent here, speaking of the apologists for punishment, sort of implies that the whole, why does punishment need apologists? Well, maybe because the whole thing is kind of a farce, right? That if we don't go with this free will idea and we don't go with this moral responsibility idea, we're punishing people who are not really guilty. And Nietzsche will talk about this in another aphorism in this section that we'll get to today. But and look, Nietzsche doesn't think, therefore, we shouldn't punish. He makes that very clear in Beyond Good and Evil. So the thing is, though, without that moral fiction, would we be able as a society to continue punishing without these moral fictions? And so perhaps we can imagine in some way, maybe in the extreme right wing, you see some of this idea that by punishing, it actually improves you, by becoming cold and heartless or something like that. Maybe the caricature of Nietzsche's Übermensch, dealing out punishment as a judge. This elevates you in some way. But again, personally, I don't see these arguments a whole lot. But the important thing is the idea that the fact that punishment needs apologetics points to something really important. All right, let's go to 220. Quote, sacrifice. The sacrificial animal does not share the spectator's ideals about sacrifice, but one has never let it have its say, end quote. Another very obvious aphorism. It hardly bears any comment at all. If you could ask the sacrificial animal about, whether or not, are you happy to become this sacrifice that's of such great value to the community and will honor the gods? The animal would say, no, I want to live. It almost doesn't even bear a comment. But there is something in that, though, that points to the fact that perhaps Nietzsche understood the thing that Girard really brought out of Nietzsche's work, that Girard would have said is maybe unconscious to Nietzsche, of the innocence of the victim and the fact that Christianity reveals the perspective of the innocent victim to the spectators through the sacrifice of Jesus. So maybe there's something of that anticipated here. Let's go to 221, quote, consideration. Fathers and sons have much more consideration for each other than mothers and daughters, end quote. I don't really have much comment here. Look, if you want to set Nietzsche's misogyny aside, you can just look at it as within a patriarchal society, when those are the values, if that is true, then the father will have more concern with the son, who's going to carry on like a legacy. He's going to have a calling and occupation, probably following the footsteps of the father. He's going to have more concern with the son. The son is like a project to him he has to shape and mold, whereas the women just sort of become a thing to you just marry those off to someone else's son, right? Now, is Nietzsche saying that's good, or is he just describing the way things are? Yeah, I'll let you figure that out for yourself. Okay, 222, quote, poet and liar. The poet considers the liar a foster brother whom he did out of his milk. Hence his brother remained weak and wretched and never attained a good conscience, end quote. So art is mendacious, art is lying, art is a falsification of the world, but it's a form of lying that has a good conscience. And that's simply the dynamic Nietzsche brings out here. 223, quote, vicarious senses. Our eyes are also intended for hearing, said an old father confessor who had become deaf, and among the blind, he that has the longest ears is king, end quote. I've often heard a modern version of this, or just a different version of this aphorism, that among the blind, he who has one eye is king. But it's interesting, so Nietzsche puts that among the blind, he who has the longest ears, he who can hear the best among the blind is king. But he puts those words into the mouth of an old father confessor who has become deaf. So it is he who has lost that faculty of sight that then looks to, well, what's the highest value, or what places you among the highest rank among those who have lost that faculty. It's like a way of esteeming yourself within that situation of a lack, right? That of course it would be the man who is deaf who makes that insight. That makes the insight that among all those who lack, well, now that if I equalize myself with everyone else who lacks the same faculty, if I still have really good hearing, in a way, I'm not lacking. I'm the king among beggars or something, something like that. The king among those who lack. So I think that's Nietzsche's point here, is that, again, the insight flows out of the character or the nature or the way that someone has turned out the way that they are. It's not these insights, these aphorisms don't come out of nowhere. Let's go to 224. Quote, animals as critics. I fear that the animals consider man as a being like themselves that is lost in a most dangerous way its sound animal common sense. They consider him the insane animal, the laughing animal, the weeping animal, the miserable animal, end quote. Now, of course, it's rather silly that animals would actually, if they could criticize us, then they wouldn't be animals, they'd be human, right? It reminds me of that passage of the ruminating cow in on the use and abuse of history. We want to ask the animal, like, why are you so happy and content in the moment? But the animal would say, if he could speak, well, every time I want to speak of my happiness, I've already forgotten about it. And of course, he doesn't say this because he even forgets that he wanted to say that and just continues ruminating in the field. So obviously the animals can't be critics, but if they could be, what would they criticize us for? The laughing animal, the weeping animal, the insane animal, the miserable animal, all the ways in which, so on the one, all of those things are sort of irrational. They're based on evaluative judgments, right? Even positive ways, like laughing, and the way we talked about earlier, joy for the sake of joy out of one's own fate, right? And an animal doesn't have that level of self-reflection. Like the animal might be happy, but he doesn't know he's happy. And it's a different way of being happy when you're happy and you know you're happy. It's also way more profound sadness when you're sad and you know that you're sad. You have the self-conception that you are sad. There's a way in which these sort of like refract and become a positive feedback loop in a sense. And so that's the thing that they're all functions of consciousness in a way, of self-awareness, that produce these states that to an animal with the animal common sense would make us seem lost in a most dangerous way. And there's a real critique here because consciousness is, in Nietzsche's view, a flawed apparatus for this very reason. It is the most prone of all of our psychic mechanisms to error and pathology. That's what ressentiment is, the inability to let go of a sensation. That only happens in consciousness, right? The conscious apparatus perceives a slight or a harm and is unable to let go of that. It becomes resentful. It becomes vindictive. It holds on. And so similarly with, the self-awareness of sadness or anxiety, depression, so on and so forth, all of these things are only possible within consciousness. And one of the things Nietzsche says is that the instincts themselves, if you were just operating strictly on instinct, the blind impulse is not going to choose what is injurious to it in the state of nature, right? That it's only with the aid of the intellect and with conscious self-reflection that that you might have an organism that actually deliberates and says, I'm going to choose this thing that's bad for me. And so the flaw of consciousness, the problems of consciousness, are the ways in which the animal world might look at us from the standpoint of critics and sort of judge us. And it's also the same reason why Nietzsche says that, and this is in Human All Too Human, error has turned animals into men. Perhaps truth can turn them back into animals again. All right, let's move to the next one. This is 225, quote, the natural. Evil has always had great effects in its favor, and nature is evil. Let us therefore be natural. This is the secret reasoning of those who have mastered the most spectacular effects, and they have all too often been considered great human beings, end quote. I mean, think about Nietzsche's comments on Napoleon. This is very clear. He says, my version of a return to nature is Napoleon. And what does that mean? Well, the French Revolution was the destruction of the old order, and you could say it's not totally anarchistic, but it lets the drives and the vindictiveness, it just lets the aggressive and the hostile drives of the populace rise up and take their revenge. And also there's reappropriation of property and public executions, and Nietzsche says it's like the revolution has this halo of fire and blood about it. And the thing is, you could argue that Rousseau had an effect on the revolution, Nietzsche, in fact, says it's the philosophy of Rousseau and not Voltaire that causes the French Revolution. He sort of protects Voltaire from that. He defends Voltaire. He's an apologist for Voltaire as still being ultimately a sort of an aristocrat in his temperament. But what does he say? He says that regardless of whether Rousseau caused the revolution or not, Rousseau had this picture of human nature that he believed in and that he popularized, that if you only remove the chains of civilization, people will naturally become good. Rousseau was sort of like Mencius in Chinese philosophy. People are naturally good, right? Which I guess was against Zunzi, I think would be the counterpart who says people are naturally evil. In the West, we have Thomas Hobbes, right, who says you need the Leviathan or people will be barbarians to one another. And Rousseau presents that opposite vision of the state of nature. Now, obviously, there's complications to this I'm not getting into, right? But you can listen to the Rousseau episode if you want to understand this. The point is, Rousseau provides this picture of the return to nature in which the goodness of man leaps out. Nietzsche says when you actually return to nature, the evil of man leaps out. And the crowning achievement of the revolution is Napoleon, who is, according to all conventional virtues, an evil man, and yet he's accounted great. He's accounted great by Schopenhauer. He's accounted great by Hegel. Hegel and Schopenhauer completely at odds. Schopenhauer hates Hegel, but they can at least agree Napoleon is a great man. Everyone seems, all the intellectuals and aristocrats agree that Napoleon is a great man. And, Goethe, Napoleon's troops come and sack his house, and he still thinks Napoleon's a great man and meets with him and discusses with him about his books. So in any case, Nietzsche says my version of a return to nature is Napoleon, this guy who can be accounted evil, who crowns himself, who makes everything basically refer back to his own value. He's self-assertive in that sort of naive master morality way, but he's not naive in that noble savage kind of way. He's naively barbaric. He's innocently barbaric. That's the return to nature signified by Napoleon. And so evil has always had the great effects in its favor, and nature is evil. Let us therefore be more natural. Think about also the passage, The Genius of the Heart, where Dionysus tells mankind, this is at the end of Beyond Good and Evil, he would like to make mankind more beautiful, yes, and more evil, more profound and more evil. And that's a very odd thing to say. I want to elevate humanity by making him more evil. But what this means is a return to nature in the sense that the state of nature is not this playground for idyllic noble savages. The state of nature is a war of all against all. And that is our true nature. That's within us. And that's how you accomplish great things, is by the use of force to smash through conventional moralities, to smash through the herd judgments and the herd timidity. Those are how great effects are accomplished, and that's where you find great people, is in that kind of return to nature. Okay, so let's go to 226. Quote, mistrust and style. We say the strongest things simply, provided only that we are surrounded by people who believe in our strength. Such an environment educates one to attain simplicity of style. The mistrustful speak emphatically. The mistrustful also make others emphatic, end quote. And again, this makes me think of just sort of like my own circle of friends. We all have respect for each other's intellect. If somebody makes an unqualified and simple statement, we're not liable to treat that statement with distrust or, begin saying, well, what are your reasons for thinking that, blah, blah, blah. Well, we might ask such a question, but not in the interrogative way of the tyrannical type of person that Nietzsche mentioned earlier, who's trying to make someone stubborn about even giving reasons, because we might actually want to understand their thought. But there's something, when you're surrounded by people who believe in your strength, surrounded by people who, like we might think of again like an Epicurean kind of garden or something like that, people who mutual respect as philosophers. Nietzsche's point here is that this kind of environment is what fosters like the aphoristic style of wisdom, because simplicity of style is allowed by people who have mutual respect for one another and for their strength of intellect or something like that. And look at academia today and how it's the opposite of that. You have to defend every last proposition with 100 footnotes and cite all of your works, and you're going to be subjected to a rigorous process, essentially, of distrust. Anyone who philosophized aphoristically in the modern day, as, say, Heraclitus did, would Heraclitus get published? Well, the world is but an ever-living fire. Source, So, no, that's not how we philosophize today, but and that's perhaps why we no longer have the seven sages and people like that. We no longer have epigrammatic wisdom, except where we find it in the past. Let's go to 227, quote, "Bad reasoning, bad shot. He cannot control himself, and from that a poor woman infers that it will be easy to control him, and casts her net for him. Soon she will be his slave." Kaufman's comment on this is elucidating that the person who can't control himself often has to control others as a sort of substitution for their lack of will or lack of self-control. So if you calculate, that guy has no control over himself, I'll be able to easily control him, it might well be that his only means of feeling his power is to control you. And if you are, in a marriage in 1800s Germany, you're going to be the one who ends up being controlled in that situation. There's no way that he's going to be controlled by you. And so that's a complete miscalculation on her part. Let's go to 228, quote, "Against mediators, those who want to mediate between two resolute thinkers show that they are mediocre. They lack eyes for seeing what is unique. Seeing things as similar and making things the same is the sign of weak eyes," end quote. This is a point where I want to rebuke Kaufman. He suggests this has something to do with the way, Nietzsche might have said this to Elizabeth, who tried to make him the same as Wagner. I don't think that's what Nietzsche's talking about at all. That's part of Kaufman's, that's a projection of Kaufman, because that's his concern, is this crusade against Elizabeth and his crusade to make Nietzsche not a Nazi, which, by the way, he's right about. Nietzsche's not a Nazi. He does exaggerate Elizabeth's influence on Nietzsche's legacy, but we can leave all that aside. This passage has nothing to do with Nietzsche and Wagner. This is Nietzsche talking about for one, it's possibly his silent hostility to Hegelianism and this idea to always find a synthesis. But we see this method of dichotomy is so central to Nietzsche's work, right? The master and slave dialectic is Hegel's picture of history moving forward. Nietzsche gives us a master and slave dichotomy. There's no dialectic between them. They are two fundamentally different ways of viewing the world that are mutually exclusive. They're different moralities that are not compatible. And it's that conflict and being able to be honest and see that conflict between them. That is, again, Nietzsche's method. Another section, very important, Kaufman actually references this in his book. It's in Wanderer in His Shadow, The Journey to Hades, when Nietzsche talks about four pairs that he met in the underworld: Epicurus and Montaigne, Pascal and Schopenhauer, Plato and Rousseau, and Goethe and Spinoza. And each of them has a similarity, right? So Nietzsche's not just against establishing any kind of similarity. But Plato and Rousseau, for example, they're similar in that they both, what would you say? They both believe in education and a revamping of education in order to change mankind. They both believe in human beings and human nature as sort of malleable according to their circumstances. But they are fundamentally opposed as regards the role of civilization and the arts and sciences and whether that has been a positive or negative development for man. For Plato, the state is the way of improving people. For Rousseau, the state has been a way of degenerating or ruining people. And similarly, each one of the people that Nietzsche brings up, like Pascal and Schopenhauer, you have with Pascal, they both share a similar view of human existence in terms of the nature of it and how terrible and horrifying it really is to live a human existence. And yet Pascal therefore demands theism, the other world. Like, this is why we must flee into faith. And Schopenhauer is resolutely atheistic, in spite of the fact that he rejects the world as well. And so seeing those differences, not trying to sublate them into one, in spite of whatever similarities there may be. I'm also reminded of, Heidegger and the way he tries to synthesize Parmenides and Heraclitus. And he does this in his lectures on Nietzsche, which I'm going to be talking about on the channel very soon, which are brilliant lectures, by the way, and Heidegger is a brilliant guy. He's trying to accomplish something in synthesizing Parmenides and Heraclitus. He's trying to bring something out that may not be immediately obvious. It's like a bit of an esoteric point, maybe even. So maybe we can cut him a little bit of slack. But I think Nietzsche would say, I think it's very clear from Nietzsche's lectures on the pre-Platonics, he would never synthesize Parmenides and Heraclitus. They are truly dichotomous. They're opposites. They're antipodes. And you should be honest about that, because you will see each one of them the clearer if you acknowledge the dichotomy, rather than trying to always overcome it. Philosophers are always trying to do this. How do we overcome the dichotomy? How do we, free will versus determinism? Both seem incomprehensible or unacceptable to people. Well, the truth must be in the middle, compatibilism. And that's what most people who study free will in philosophy and academia believe, is compatibilism. A fundamentally illogical, nonsensical position is what most of them believe, because they want to mediate between two extremes, and they think that that's wisdom. And, all the way to the end of Nietzsche's career, he will maintain that's not wisdom, right? Failing to perceive a fundamental antagonism. And failing to choose between the two when a decision is called for, and trying to come up with some mediation. That's weakness. It's cowardice in the face of reality. Let's go to 229, quote, obstinacy and faithfulness. Obstinately, he clings to something that he has come to see through, but he calls it faithfulness, end quote. Very obvious and clear aphorism, so I'm not going to spend much time on it. The obvious example is a religious person who has seen through his faith insofar as he's seen all the problems with it. Maybe he's come to understand that the historicity of Jesus, maybe Jesus was a historical figure, but it seems very clear that many of the stories attributed to him are written later and they're full of contradictions. And maybe they see all this and they think, it makes my faith even stronger to affirm this in spite of the fact that it's illogical. I'm going to hold on to my faith. And I think Nietzsche's very simple insight here is that what we call faithfulness is usually just obstinacy. It's just ultimately stubbornness is what explains this. It's the will to stupidity. But we christen it with a holy name. Let's go to 230, quote, dearth of silence. His whole nature fails to persuade. That is because he has never remained silent about any of his good deeds, end quote. And just a brief comment. I think we all kind of experience this, especially in the workplace. There's a whole school of thought that you should, if you want the promotion, you should always talk yourself up, right? And it always surprises me how this seems to work. And maybe that just points to the low quality of the bosses once again, but it's always very obvious to the other workers, isn't it? To the peers of that person when you're in some sort of meeting and you say, well, I did this and I did that. And they're always talking themselves up of their accomplishments. It's so obvious that what they're trying to do is sort of steal or hoard all that glory for themselves. And which in and of itself sort of points to the fact that you should perhaps be suspicious of that person. It makes them less than persuasive, because there's not an essential contradiction between talking up your accomplishments and actually accomplishing things. It's just a correlation, an inverse correlation that people tend to notice, that the people who accomplish the most often don't have to brag about it. That bragging about it is often like a substitution for the fact that you don't have an accomplishment. All right, let's go to 231, quote, the thorough. Those who are slow to know suppose that slowness is of the essence of knowledge, end quote. And I've talked a lot throughout the history of the podcast of Nietzsche, talking about passing through different convictions, talking about going through the camel phase and proceeding at a tortoise pace. He even uses that language. But it should never be construed that Nietzsche thinks that if that's the only pace you can go, that is therefore a virtue. You should slow yourself down, slow your intellect that wants to flit from place to place and make it sit still and focus and make it really absorb and think through to the end a given postulate or conviction or something. If it's just simply that you're a slow, stagnant, to use the word in its most proper form, a retarded thinker, in that your progress is just inherently slow, that's not a virtue in and of itself. And that doesn't point to anything about the nature of knowledge. That points back to you, right? Okay, let's go to 232, quote, "Dreams. Either we have no dreams or our dreams are interesting. We should learn to arrange our waking life in the same way. Nothing or interesting," end quote. This is another one I have very little comment on. I think it is true that dreams don't tend to be remembered unless they are interesting. We forget the vast majority of dreams that we have, and the ones that stand out to us in our memory are the ones that were extraordinary or seemed profound in some way or particularly unusual, that were interesting in some way. The rest, the ordinary experiences we have in dreams, to whatever extent they exist, are mostly forgotten about. And Nietzsche says perhaps we should do that with our own waking life. And so this is the value of forgetting in Nietzsche's thought, that it's actually good to forget about the mundane carbon copy experiences that you have and to actively turn your focus toward the extraordinary. That forgetting is active and positive because it clears the ground so that only the extraordinary can stand. All right, let's go to the next one, 233, quote, "The most dangerous point of view. What I do or do not do now is as important for everything that is yet to come as is the greatest event of the past. In this tremendous perspective of effectiveness, all actions appear equally great and small," end quote. This one is it's so profound that I almost have nothing to say about it because it's so simple and straightforward that there's really nothing to untangle here. It's just a shift of your perspective, right? You can look at yourself as bound by all the causes of the past of which you are an effect and say, all of these things have determined where my life is now. Or you can say, yes, but my actions now are the pasts of a future that has not yet come. They're the causes of an effect that has not yet been realized. And so every action, great and small, that I make will bear the fruits of my life in the future. And who knows which actions in the present will be great and which ones will be small. Because we'll only be able to establish that in retrospect. We'll only be able to establish what the causes were by the later effect. Remember that earlier aphorism. Let's go to 234, quote, "A musician's comfort. Your life does not reach men's ears. Your life is silent for them, and all the subtleties of its melody, all tender resolutions about following or going ahead, remain hidden from them. True, you do not approach on a broad highway with regimental music, but that does not give these good people any right to say that your life lacks music. Let those who have ears hear," end quote. And Nietzsche puts that entire thing in scare quotes. And in my experience, when Nietzsche does this, and he doesn't assign the quote to a given character, it's not because he's trying to distance himself from that saying. It's almost like he's breaking the fourth wall and speaking to himself or something of that nature. I think this should bear more study of Nietzsche's quotation, scare quotes, remarks to himself within his own works. And somebody should go through and look and find all of these, because oftentimes it seems like he's being more honest. It seems like perhaps he's putting it in another voice to give the appearance of distancing himself, because he's no longer that, what might we say, omniscient narrator that the philosopher is supposed to be. But it is very clearly Nietzsche talking about his own work and treating it almost like a matter of musical taste, right? I mean, he's specifically saying all of your tender resolutions about following or going ahead remain hidden from them. That's what he's had multiple aphorisms in these sections talking about that, following, rushing ahead, and the herd following after him, or the one who goes ahead having less virtue or spirit than the one who follows and remains behind. He's talking about the themes that he himself has been discussing and saying they remain hidden from the many. And you don't approach the broad highway. What does he say? Yeah, you do not approach on a broad highway with regimental music. So like the marching music that sort of brings along the whole crowd. And so he says, let those who have ears hear. And, it reminds me of sort of those who have very particular tastes in music, those musicians who make music for those with a very particular taste, who will just openly acknowledge this isn't for everybody. And that's very much Nietzsche's attitude with his philosophy. And that's his musicians' comfort, that only those with ears to hear will hear him. So let's go to 235, quote, spirit and character. Some reach their peak as characters, but their spirit is not up to this height, while with others it happens the other way around, end quote. So spirit, we might say vitality, elan vital, drive, and character, the ability to organize yourself, organize your virtue according to your ideal, something like that. We might say somebody who possessed both spirit and character in the viewpoint of Nietzsche would be Goethe. But what are the examples of people who reach their peak as characters, but their spirit is not up to this height? We might say somebody like Spinoza, who was very influential on Goethe. Spinoza is a great character. His life story is incredible. He becomes a good European, right? He leaves his native tribe and becomes a citizen of the world. And yet, Spinoza perhaps is lacking in spirit in like a real physiological sense, in that he's sort of like sickly. Nietzsche describes in his notes Spinoza as like a sickly ideal, and that in many ways his philosophy ultimately turns upon this sickliness. Maybe an example of someone who's the other way around, who has spirit but not character, would be maybe an example from Nietzsche. In Nietzsche's view, would be Shakespeare, someone who is sort of like boorish and plebeian and very much lacking in character, but he's certainly spirited. I mean, look at the productivity of somebody like Shakespeare, the accomplishments of somebody like Shakespeare. Let's go to 236. Quote, to move the crowd. Must not anyone who wants to move the crowd be an actor who impersonates himself? Must he not first translate himself into grotesque obviousness and then present his whole person and cause in this coarsened and simplified version? End quote. It's very funny that Kaufman tied that other aphorism to Wagner when it didn't bear any relationship to it at all. He does not provide any footnote to this aphorism mentioning Wagner, but it's very clear that Nietzsche is talking about somebody like Wagner, whom he describes as being a kind of actor or even a magician. We might recall the aphorism from Beyond Good and Evil, a great man, I only see the actor of his own ideal. And we might also think of the passage from Human All Too Human about political parties. They all have to paint their ideals into giant frescoes of stupidity in order to motivate the coarseness and, as Nietzsche puts it here, the grotesque obliviousness of the crowd. They have to present their ideals in a simplified and coarsened version, and that's what the great man who wishes to move a crowd has to do, and that's exactly what happens to Wagner. 237, quote, polite. He is so polite. Yes, he always carries a biscuit for Cerberus, and is so timid that he thinks everyone is a Cerberus, even you and I. That is his politeness, end quote. Yet another aphorism which sort of explains a character trait or an aspect of someone's personality that might not seem to have anything to do with will to power, but which actually does, which can be explained in that way, which can be psychologically explained through baser motives. So politeness, in this sense, it's a politeness that expresses a lack, a what might we say, the constant drive to avoid any conflict, seeing everyone as a Cerberus, the three-headed dog that guards the entrance of the underworld. That it really expresses that kind of, I mean, to put it in very vulgar terms, like that slave moralist turning outward and an orientation based on fear of the other. And that's not to say that's what politeness always is, Nietzsche's own politeness. Nietzsche was known to be polite, and I don't think he would characterize his own politeness as coming out of a lack. It could be like a sort of generosity of spirit. It could be out of an abundance, but he, again, is pointing to a certain type of person. That's another thing we have to understand with all of these sort of psychological outlines of different types that he's giving throughout these sections. Almost nothing he's saying here is a universal. He's just saying there is a type of person like this. They appear one way, and we might be misled as to what's really driving that. But in certain cases, what's driving politeness is that fear that regarding everyone else as like, we all know people like this. They're polite because they're non-confrontational, right? They're afraid of confrontation. And that's very different from someone who's polite not because they're afraid of confrontation, but who might even be willing to engage in confrontation in the proper setting or for the proper reason. But there is certainly a kind of person who is polite because they are non-confrontational. 238, quote, without envy. He is utterly without envy, but there is no merit in that, for he wants to conquer a country that nobody has possessed and scarcely anyone has ever seen, end quote. And this is funny because it's like, this is a similar type of thing. You might say, well, he's not envious, so what a virtuous man. But it's because the thing that he wants, no one else wants, so he has no one to envy. And is that bad? We might say it's unmerited from the standpoint that envy is always bad, but I don't think Nietzsche holds that view personally. I mean, he says the whole Greek society is driven by envy. That gets complicated because envy is kind of a reactive way of being in the world, right? So it's not like he has absolute praise for the Greek morality and thinks we should absolutely emulate it. But this does point to something. Also, it points to something about Nietzsche. I mean, perhaps he is the one who wants to conquer a country that no one has ever seen with his philosophy. And that's why he is not envious of other philosophers. Not because he, simply is so virtuous that he would never dare to be envious, but he just simply wants something that no one else has ever had. 239, quote, joyless. A single joyless person is enough to create constant discouragement in cloudy skies for a whole household, and it is a miracle if there is not one person like that. Happiness is not nearly so contagious a disease. Why? End quote. This is Nietzsche's, we might think of how he thinks of pity as contagious, how ressentiment can be contagious, the bad conscience can be contagious. Really all the moral feelings and states of Christianity can be contagious. But that points to something about gloominess, about a depressive or negative view of life as being able to spread, whereas happiness doesn't have that same aspect. In fact, we can even say when somebody is excessively happy around a joyless person, that's more likely to be taken as like a sort of affront to the joyless person. The joyless person is more likely to try and drag the happy person down than the opposite of like the happy person lifting them up into happiness. And what does this mean? I mean, and I think it's entirely possible that at this point in his career, Nietzsche might not have a clear answer. He actually is posing why. Or he might have the inkling already, because he does eventually come to an answer, that in some way it's a question of health and sickness, right? So health doesn't spread to other people. Sickness spreads to other people, right? So the sick person makes the healthy person sick, but the healthy person doesn't make the sick person healthy. And that's the whole premise for keep the sick away from the healthy. Have this pathos of distance, right, that Nietzsche really believes in, that we need to have, like revivify the pathos of distance that was understood by ancient moralities. That's one of the things he wants to salvage from them. And that's part of this is why. It's like a single gloomy person in your household drags everyone down. And I think that's quite true. 240, quote, "At the sea, I would not build a house for myself, and I count it part of my good fortune that I do not own a house. But if I had to, then I should build it as some of the Romans did, right into the sea. I should not mind sharing a few secrets with this beautiful monster," end quote. And we simply have to remember, Nietzsche self-identifies with the wanderer figure in his philosophy, especially near this period of his work, the Free Spirit trilogy, as they call it. The figure of the wanderer is often invoked as sort of we might say, a prefiguration of who Zarathustra is. And Nietzsche quite literally lives as a wanderer, moving from place to place, sort of migrating with the seasons at this time. And he considers it his good fortune that he doesn't own a house. But if he did, he would do it in the fashion of the Romans, right up to the sea, which I think has an element of like, build your temples in the slopes of Vesuvius. It's somewhat dangerous to build your house right up to the sea. But when he says, I would not mind sharing a few secrets with this beautiful monster. The beautiful monster is the sea itself, right? And the sea is such a fecund repository of all of these associations and images throughout the history of like Western poetry. Of the sea is like the abyss, it's desolation, it's the expanse, but it's also this thing that you have to travel or sojourn across to find new lands and something like that. And just the sea is such like if Nietzsche is going to fix himself in one place, he wants to be fixed by this place, which still, speaks of or reveals like this expanse, this place in which you can wander beyond the boundaries of the city walls, something like that. 241, quote, "Work and artist. This artist is ambitious, nothing more. Ultimately, his work is merely a magnifying glass that he offers everybody who looks his way," end quote. This is something about art Nietzsche often talks about, that art magnifies. That's what the eulogy does. When you eulogize someone, nowadays we eulogize people who are dead, but the ancients would eulogize living people. The eulogy is sort of like a poem of praise, and what do? You magnify their good traits, you kind of let the bad traits fade into the background, right? It's not as if they're not there, but your art has that distorting effect. It has that magnifying effect of bringing one or two things out into the foreground and letting the rest be only background. And so he says, this artist is ambitious. That's all he offers in his work. It's merely a magnifying glass for everybody who looks his way. So what is the magnifying glass pointing at? It's pointing back at the artist in this case. And so that there are some artists that in their work, what is magnified is merely the artist himself, and the work is merely a way of raising the profile or elevating the artist himself. Again, not all art. This is a type of artist. It's a type of person. The next one is 242, and the name is suum cuique, which means to each his own in Latin. Quote, "However great the deed of my desire for knowledge may be, I still cannot take anything out of things that did not belong to me before. What belongs to others remains behind. How is it possible for a human being to be a thief or robber?" End quote. And this ties into many comments Nietzsche has made, that our insights, our ideas, what belongs to us intellectually, may be those things that only we have a right to. That if you were able to hold an idea, there's something already in you, even if you discover the idea from someone else, somebody who wrote thousands of years ago. But if it resonates with you, that resonates with something about your drives, your character, your circumstances, your biography. And in that sense, nobody can really be a thief or a robber, because even if they take all their ideas from other people, if they truly understand and integrate those ideas, they belong to that person now. And we might think of Plato's understanding that learning is remembering, that we're simply, when something speaks to you, it speaks to your intuition. It's like you're remembering something that you forgot, something that's been so obvious that it's sort of perhaps been in the background, but as soon as you really adopt the idea and it comes to the forefront, you say, I always knew this. I just couldn't articulate it. Well, what is that? That's revealing that you had a right to that idea, that it was whatever. You can't take anything that doesn't already belong to you, as Nietzsche puts it in this passage. Let's go to 243, quote, "Origin of good and bad. Improvements are invented only by those who can feel that something is not good," end quote. This is another misfire with Kaufmann's footnote, because he says, well, this is a different account than Nietzsche gives in Human All Too Human and Beyond Good and Evil in the genealogy on his history of morals, the history of the terms good and bad. It's actually not. It's just speaking to something different. He's talking about the desire to improve mankind and the fact that improvement necessarily constitutes a judgment and therefore a condemnation of what is. So when Plato says we should actually live in this ideal republic, what he's doing is judging and condemning the current structure of the polis. If the polis already reflected Plato's republic, he wouldn't need to write the republic. It would just be him accounting the laws that already exist. Instead, it remains an ideal, it remains a scheme for improving mankind because it's not the way things already are. You have to feel that things are not good now if you're going to say it would be better if this were the case. And that is the condemnatory nature of morality itself, the morality as always preached by those who wish to improve mankind in some way or another. And so Nietzsche really here is not speaking about the history, the origin of good and bad, even though he calls it that way. He's not speaking of that in the sense of like anthropologically or etymologically or philologically, as he does in Genealogy of Morals and those other passages that prefigure the genealogy. He says origin of good and bad here. He means the origin of valuations as given by a lawgiver. A lawgiver is someone who comes and judges the current situation and therefore provides an ideal which stands in judgment of it, attempts to negate the way things are. Things are bad now, they need to be good. Okay, let's go to 244, quote, "Thoughts and words. Even one's thoughts one cannot reproduce entirely in words," end quote. We've already kind of talked about this within these sections, about your thoughts being the shadow of a feeling, that there are the most profound thoughts, your highest insights, or we might say the virtues most unique to your character will be incommunicable because the word always has to provide. In order for words to have utility, they have to be commonly understood. What the word means is what other people understand by the word. And so even one's thoughts, one cannot reproduce entirely in words. The only parts of your thoughts that you'll be able to reproduce entirely in words will be those aspects of the thought which can be understood and conveyed within the word, which necessarily means comprehensible to the great many. And so there are ways in which the deepest thoughts are incommunicable. We've talked about this a lot in the podcast, so I won't elaborate further. 245, quote, "Praise by choice. An artist chooses his subjects. That is his way of praising," end quote. And I think, in the same way that Nietzsche, when he says, if somebody merits a response from me, whether it's critical response or a praiseworthy response, either way it's praise, right? And so in the same way, the artist chooses his subjects. That's his way of praising. That's what he's going to magnify, focus on, give merit to, even if the subject that the artist focuses on is entirely, we might say, portrayed negatively or something like that. We might say, both The Wolf of Wall Street and Atlas Shrugged praise the rich, captain of industry, or, I guess financial traders aren't captains of industry, but, the one who manages to make himself great simply by the fact that he makes a lot of money. And that is what I believe one of the characters says in Atlas Shrugged, that is their only drive, is making a lot of money, right? But through that, they become great or something like that. The point I'm making here is like the portrayal of either one as a central figure in a way is a sort of praise for that figure, even if it's entirely negative, because you are locating you're locating such a figure as meriting your artistic attention. 246, quote, "Mathematics, let us introduce the refinement and rigor of mathematics into all sciences, as far as this is at all possible, not in the faith that this will lead us to know things, but in order to determine our human relations to things. Mathematics is merely the means for general and ultimate knowledge of man, end quote. I mean, wow, that one really throws a monkey wrench into a lot of people's perception of Nietzsche as an irrationalist, doesn't it? I mean, it definitely does not make him a rationalist or a positivist, because he says ultimately the value refers back to man. But something Deleuze says is notable here, where he says Nietzsche never takes aim at turning, how does he put it? Nietzsche does not turn quantities into qualities. What he takes aim against is the equalization of unequal quantities. And that there is something about Nietzsche as a thinker that is essentially quantitative. That by speaking of the world in terms of will to power, we begin to understand human beings as a quantitative concern of who holds the greatest quantity of power in a given case, and then looking at the situation, like looking at the values of both parties, looking at the interaction between both parties from that consideration, which is ultimately a quantity, even if it's not like a perfectly defined quantity. And so that's a way in which the quantification of everything, the mathematizing of everything, refers back to the understanding of human relations. But just as a broader point, it is very interesting that he says we should introduce the refinement and rigor of mathematics into all sciences as far as this is possible. It reminds me of Spinoza's sort of presupposition that for philosophy, it should become mathematized, right? Which you might say that's like a prefiguration of analytical philosophy. That to really become useful, there has to be this quantification of the discipline. This is also like Peter Turchin's proposition regarding history, that it should become a truly mathematized science. And I think all of that is of a spirit with Nietzsche. I always reject this idea that, descriptively speaking, Nietzsche is sort of like against reason or against science. This book really proves that he is not. He really wants to get into the guts of all of these issues and understand the inner workings of things. And he was also very taken with like Boscovich and his single equation for explaining all force relations, right, according to the distance at which they manifest. So I think all of that is very informative for like the role of mathematics in Nietzsche's work. He's pro-mathematics. He's pro-quantification of all of these things, because quantity, when we speak of things in terms of qualities, it can sometimes hide the fact that there's fundamentally a quantitative difference underlying two things, or two people, or two values. And we could see all of Nietzsche's revaluation of values as a quantification of whether or not a given value is actually qualified to be a value, for whether there's a quantity of power contained within the valuation, or relative to other values, how much power does that valuation provide? And this is all very abstract, but I think sometimes speaking in terms of qualities can be even more abstract in a way. Let's go to 247, quote, habit. Every habit lends our hand more wit, but makes our wit less handy, end quote. Fairly self-explanatory there. Your hand is lended more wit because, that's muscle memory, basically. That the habits, the things you do every day, all of your usual activities, like by playing guitar all the time, my hand is now wittier when it comes to the guitar. I don't have to sit down and think about how to play the guitar every time. It just, my hand knows what to do. But it makes our wit less handy insofar as by not applying your mind to these processes, these things you do usually every day over and over and over again, and they become habits, that makes, you're not rethinking how things are done from the ground up every time. That's both a blessing and a curse in a way, because oftentimes the great mistakes that have been made throughout human history a lot of the time are people just saying, well, that's the way we've always done things, and refusing to, or being unable to, rethink the situation when necessary. 248, quote, books. What good is a book that does not even carry us beyond all books? End quote. Another one that I'm going to say, I think, if it's not self-explanatory, but it bears very little commentary. I think it would be better if you think about that yourself. 249, quote, the sigh of the search for knowledge. O my greed, there is no selflessness in my soul, but only an all-coveting self that would like to appropriate many individuals as so many additional pairs of eyes and hands, a self that would like to bring back the whole past too, and that will not lose anything that it could possibly possess. Oh, my greed is a flame. Oh, that I might be reborn in 100 beings. Whoever does not know this sigh from first-hand experience does not know the passion of the search for knowledge. End quote. So that whole first section before Nietzsche says, whoever doesn't know this, that's also put in scare quotes. It's again another statement that scare quotes does not distance that from Nietzsche. He in fact makes it very clear that if he's going to stand in judgment of, like, if you haven't had this experience, you don't know the passion for knowledge, then presumably he's had that experience, right? He would have to have that experience to make that judgment. So he's had that experience of sort of looking out with that greedy passion for, I mean, as he says, appropriating all of these hundreds of things and individuals from the past, letting nothing slip away. And the important thing here, I think, as regards Nietzsche's broader philosophy, is that his passion for knowledge, it is a passion. There is nothing selfless about it. It's greed that's driving the pursuit of knowledge. That will to truth is will to power. And that's what comes out there. And anyone who speaks about the disinterested truth, the dispassionate truth, that person has not had this kind of experience, right? They don't know what they're talking about. And I certainly have had that kind of attitude towards knowledge. And I think most of you probably have too. That's probably why you're listening to this. Okay, 250, quote, guilt. Although the shrewdest judges of the witches and even the witches themselves were convinced of the guilt of witchery, this guilt, nevertheless, did not exist. This applies to all guilt, end quote. So this involves, this is the passage I mentioned earlier when I talked about the apologia for punishment, and that this is Nietzsche's true position on guilt, that there is no guilt. He believes nature's totally innocent. All things are fated. There is no moral responsibility. We're just like all the other animals. These are all invented concepts. To the extent that guilt exists, we might say it would be like, you know, like there's certain kinds of bats that live here in North America where if one of them eats too much of the food that they collect, all the other bats will like beat them up and rush them away. Basically like exile the bad bat, for a crime it committed. Now, was that bat like, you know, typically with animals, we don't look at them and say, you know, like, oh, well, you could have done differently with your free will and you had a moral obligation or imperative to not eat more of the food than was your allotted share. So what do we see with that? We see the herd morality, even within animals. And Nietzsche's argument would be all of our conceptions of good, evil, guilt, and punishment, these all are just a slightly more sophisticated version of that herd morality that can even be seen in animals. Now, the witches example, the reason why he uses that as an analogy is because it's an example where we know the guilt is false. We now look back on that and say, well, they weren't really witches, but they didn't know that. Even the women themselves sometimes believed that they were witches. Even the shrewdest judges thought witchcraft was real. These people are really endangering human souls, trafficking with the devil. And Nietzsche's point is, that's how all guilt is. Just as sure as those judges were, we are just as sure when we punish the criminal that they truly are guilty. Now, again, does that mean we shouldn't have punishment? I mean, you could argue without it, society would collapse, right? That does not make it true. That's the point. Okay, 251, quote, misunderstood sufferers. Magnificent characters suffer very differently from what their admirers imagine. They suffer most keenly from the ignoble and petty agitations of some evil moments, briefly from their doubts about their own magnificence, not from the sacrifices and martyrdoms that their task demands from them. As long as Prometheus feels pity for men and sacrifices himself for them, he is happy and great. But when he becomes envious of Zeus and the homage paid to him by mortals, then he suffers." End quote. This is interesting because out of his pity for man, Prometheus is made great. That's not normally a formulation that Nietzsche would use. Even by the end of Book 3, a section we'll get to by the end of this, Nietzsche is already calling out the harm of pity. But what's interesting about the Prometheus story is that Prometheus sees a real value in mankind. Like, what he gives mankind is techne. What he gives them is the ability to improve, to build, to create things. And so his pity for man isn't like trying to relieve their suffering so much as it is trying to impart them with a gift. It's more like a generosity from Prometheus to make man greater than they are. And it's his jealousy, his enviousness of Zeus that ultimately Nietzsche suggests causes his suffering. So the point, magnificent characters suffer very differently from what their admirers imagine. And he says they suffer most keenly from ignoble and petty agitations, from some evil moments, from doubts about their own magnificence. So in a way, he's saying they suffer most greatly, not in Prometheus's case from having his liver ripped out by vultures, but from the knowledge of the fact that he results in that position because of his own pettiness as regards to Zeus, his own reactive relationship to Zeus, we might say, something like that. That's what really torments the great souls. That the moments where they reveal themselves to themselves as being human, all too human. All right, let's go to 252, quote, better a debtor than pay with a coin that does not bear our image, says our sovereignty," end quote. Of course, the sovereign mints his image onto the coin. So it would be better to owe someone, to therefore be subordinate to someone else within their power, because that is the creditor-debtor relationship. The creditor, at least historically, has power over the debtor. It's better to therefore put oneself in that relationship than to pay with a coin that doesn't bear your image. So there's something here, it's very ambiguous, but there's something about being genuine, about not just genuine, but as Nietzsche says, sovereign, in the sense of not falsifying yourself in order to pay your debts. We might look at it as simply as, to put it in hippie 60s, 70s terms, right? Are you going to sell out and work for the man, or are you going to live a life of poverty as like a relative poverty, as a hippie and a drifter and an artist, and be true to yourself, right? Better to be that person who is sort of on the underclass, who's on the outskirts of society, who is nonetheless sovereign and true to himself, than someone who falsifies himself as a way to sort of like pay his debts to society. 253, quote, always at home. One day we reach our goal and now point with pride to the long travels we undertook to reach it. In fact, we were not even aware of traveling, but we got so far because we fancied at every point that we were at home, end quote. And so we might relate this to Nietzsche's statements about cause and effect, that we see the effect now and then we calculate backward to the cause. So we reach our goal and then we point back to the causes of the reaching of our goal, of everything we had to overcome and travel through to reach that. But what Nietzsche says, like what he's implying is like those who actually reach a goal were not even aware of traveling. They were at home in every moment. And I'm going to relate this to my own life again. I mean, in terms of playing music. And so if you want to be a successful band in the modern age, especially in like rock music, metal, the kind of thing I do, you got to go on tour. You got to be part of the underground scene. You have to play a lot of shows, many of which will not be good. You're going to, there's always a first time that you have to go to a new city and play in front of a new audience. And a lot of people, a lot of musicians find that when they get into this game, they're not suited for it. And they burn out, or they realize being on tour sucks. A lot of the time it sucks. It's actually one of the best things in the world, but, in the same way that camping can suck, you don't have modern luxuries all the time. It's not always comfortable, and it can be soul-crushing at times even. But the kind of person who's at home in that environment, who says, you know what, I love this, even though it's not like, quote unquote, the goal. I'm not playing in an arena in front of tens of thousands of people or hundreds of thousands of people. I'm playing in a nightclub in front of 100 people. But nevertheless, this is fulfilling for me right now. I've already reached it. I've already hit my goal. I am there, right? The people who have that attitude are the ones who succeed. Not all of them, but it's sort of like almost a prerequisite for success. It's necessary but not sufficient, right? And so the broader point is that, somebody looks back at all the challenges or adversity that they've overcome and, then says, that's how I reached this goal. But in the moment, the people who are successful in reaching their goals are reaching their goal every moment, really. They're living in such a way that their life is acceptable to them at every moment, or even embraced by them at every moment. 254, quote, against embarrassment. If you are always profoundly occupied, you are beyond all embarrassment, end quote. And I just want to reference one of Nietzsche's statements where he said, I believe in his journals, what is my happiness to me? What is my contentment? I have my work. And this is very true. I mean, you don't have time for anything else. If you're truly absorbed into your great calling, into your work, you will not have time to be embarrassed or ashamed or distracted by any of these other feelings. Throw yourself into a great project. It's really the key for happiness. 255, quote, imitators. A says, what, you want imitators? B says, I do not want to have people imitate my example. I wish that everybody would fashion his own example as I do. A says, so, end quote. And I think A's incredulity, or sort of thumbing his nose at this, is at the inherent contradiction here, right? That Zarathustra says, here is my way, whereas yours, I don't want you to imitate my ideal. I want you to go away from me, repudiate me. Do not remain my pupil. Become your own model for existence. Find your own way. This is like kind of a paradox, right? Because you say like, well, my ideal is for you to find your own ideal. So if somebody finds their own ideal and rejects yours, are they actually following your ideal? And therefore, are the people who are following your ideal actually rejecting your ideal? And there's a way in which you could say that the entire expression that you should all find your own ideal is kind of superfluous. It doesn't really, it's like, so what? Okay, well, everyone is always finding their own ideal at every moment. And so I think this is Nietzsche poking fun at himself. It's part of his comedic solution. He realizes in saying that he wants no imitators, there's sort of like inherently a contradiction or a paradox there. And yet, from a sort of higher perspective, a higher level, it's very clear what Nietzsche is saying, right? He's promoting the ideal of anti-idealism in some ways. He's promoting a morality of immorality. Let's go to 256. Skin-coveredness, that's what he calls it. Quote, all people who have depth find happiness in being for once like flying fish, playing on the peaks of waves. What they consider best in things is that they have a surface, their skin-coveredness. Sit vinia verbo, end quote. And that means forgive the word. The German word that Nietzsche coined is Hautlichkeit. So skin-coveredness. That's why he's saying forgive the word, because he's had to invent a new word to talk about what he means. But Kaufman points out this, we should refer back to the preface that he appended to the Gay Science. All people who have depth find happiness in enjoying what is on the skin, on the surface, right? So playing on the waves of the surface of the water, enjoying their skin-coveredness, which we might say the ocean itself, like what lurks beneath the deep, it has none of the shape and like how do I put this? Like the dance and the play of the waves and all the imagery and everything you could see in the waves, just like you can kind of find imagery in clouds or something like that. That's all surface level, right? But enjoying that it's a luxury, or it's almost like a compensatory need of people who are deep. And the reason why we should refer that back to the preface is, what does Nietzsche say? Those Greeks, they lived in appearance. They lived on the surface. They stopped courageously at the surface. And that's what he's describing here, is sort of like seeing the image, the appearance, as the place of this great aesthetic richness and out of profundity. 257, quote, "From experience, some people do not know how rich they are until they experience how rich people steal from them," end quote. Again, all of these metaphors here of poverty and richness and debt and credit that refer to something really spiritual or philosophical, intellectual. Again, talking about the sort of like being surrounded by these threadbare scarecrow mere scholars versus people who steal. And Nietzsche says it would rather suit his taste to have people steal from him. But then there's the contradiction of like, why would rich people steal from you? And we might say this is just like another overturning of, or Nietzsche playing with these sort of like oxymoronic statements, these contradictions in order to bring something out, that the people who are rich in spirit do steal in the same way that it's impossible from another perspective for them to steal, because all of the ideas that they have were ideas that they had a right to in the first place, ideas that they are remembering, the ideas that they are rediscovering that they always knew but didn't articulate, right? And so some don't know how rich they are until they see how others take from them to expand their richness. And that's what rich souls do, is that they know how to appropriate. They have that greedy hunger for knowledge that Nietzsche talks about, appropriating from all things, from all past ages and everything. 258, quote, "The denial of chance. No victor believes in chance," end quote. So, of course, when you lose the match, well, then in that case, you can point out all the ways in which chance contributed to your loss, right? When you win, it was from your own gumption. And, there's something about this. Nietzsche, he criticizes the pre-Platonic Democritus by saying he describes everything in terms of chance, whereas I would rather describe it in terms of lawful necessity or rigorous necessity. And I think that is informative here, because Nietzsche would see everything in terms of necessity, but he also points out in other passages how many, this is in Beyond Good and Evil, where he talks about people who believe in free will, it's often because they don't want to attribute their victory to chance, or to necessity in that case. And oftentimes people who believe in unfree will, it's because they don't want to attribute their immorality or their guilt or their losses or their failures to or because they do want to attribute those things to necessity, right? So free will is sort of something, it seems like an unprovable or unfalsifiable hypothesis, but people believe it or disbelieve it according to some need that they have. 259, quote, "From paradise, good and evil are the prejudices of God, said the snake," end quote. And I don't know what to say about this one. It's all there on the face of it. Nietzsche's saying we can draw some insight from the snake in the Garden of Eden. And this is why I think in Beyond Good and Evil, he has that one passage where sort of like a hypothetical commentary on Nietzsche's work saying, what are you saying? God is refuted, but the devil is not? Because oftentimes Nietzsche's wisdom sounds like it comes from, frankly, the devil. 260, quote, "Multiplication table. 1 is always wrong, but with 2, truth begins. 1 cannot prove his case, but 2 are irrefutable," end quote. On the surface, you could say 1 person cannot prove a case, but 2 people, then you have a corroboration of the case that someone's making. So maybe there's something like just that basic going on here. But I think there's something that Nietzsche is drawing out that refers to seeing dichotomy as revealing the two sides equally, that if you just have, for example, the Christian morality and you don't know anything else, like that's just the world you live in. You live in the high Middle Ages. Christian morality is just reality. It's like one fish, the older fish swimming by the younger fish and saying, "Hey boys, how's the water?" And they say, "Water? What is he talking about?" Because Christianity is just the water you're swimming in. So you need, for example, the Greek paganism that Nietzsche brings up as a contrast, not just to reveal like the Greek paganism, not just to like be like, "Oh, look at this," like, because even that is not really revealed until we see the contrast of Christianity to it, right? The ancient Greeks wouldn't have had any concept of really what was unique or unparalleled in their morality until the Christian revaluation of values. So by negating, you know what the other thing is, but not. So I could see a Hegelian saying, "Well, isn't that very Hegelian?" Well, no, because they never sublate, right? It's understanding actually that they are two, that there is a contrast here that is irreconcilable, that reveals both in what they are. It reveals their nature. So you need the Greek to understand the Christian. You need Dionysus to understand the crucified, and vice versa. 261, quote, "Originality. What is originality? To see something that has no name as yet and hence cannot be mentioned, although it stares us all in the face. The way men usually are, it takes a name to make something visible for them. Those with originality have, for the most part, also assigned names," end quote. And we might think every great legislator of values did this, right? They gave a name to some new value so that we could see it. That's what originality really is. So the creation of an original idea is not actually to create something ex nihilo. It's to give a name to something that is already staring us in the face. That's what Nietzsche does when he gives the name will to power, to the world, to life, to the character of life. That it's not as if Nietzsche is saying, "I created the world as will to power." No, I gave a name to the world as will to power, right? I'm not God himself creating the world. But I am Adam naming all the things in the world, to use a perhaps offensively religious thing. We could say that pretty much every philosopher does this, right? That there's like a core concept that's usually associated with any given philosopher, where if we, go down the list, let's talk about some of the ones we've already talked about, like Spinoza. We know him as the philosopher of natura, God and nature, something like that. It's not as if the word natura did not exist. The concept of nature did not exist. It's that he names God by calling it nature, right? That he gives nature and God a whole new sense. And, or we might say with Schopenhauer, will becomes like a very important word. It's not as if we didn't already have the word will, but now Schopenhauer is looking at the world as will. And when Nietzsche says will to power, he gives a new sense, not only to will, not only to power, but also to the world. And there's something very Wittgensteinian in that point, that what the philosopher is doing is sort of just renaming things, giving us a new language, a new lexicon. And that's what constitutes originality. It's very interesting. 262, it's subspecie eterni is the name of this, and that is from Spinoza, actually, which means from the point of view of eternity. Quote, A says, "You are moving away faster and faster from the living. Soon they will strike your name from their rolls." B says, "That is the only way to participate in the privilege of the dead." A asks, "What privilege?" B says, "To die no more," end quote. And again, I would reference The Journey to Hades, aphorism of Nietzsche, where he says, "The eyes of these 8 souls within the underworld lock their eyes with mine. I will allow them to give judgment to me. I will accept judgment from them, and I will allow them to give judgment to one another. And from them alone will I take counsel." And another thing he says in that passage is, "Forgive me if I would say that in the world of the living sometimes seems less alive than these 8 dead men who I hear reference as my greatest, influences, or among my greatest influences." So the dead, this world of dead philosophers and thinkers that Nietzsche, in that earlier aphorism, says is the object of his greed, that's, so in this aphorism here, when he has a hypothetical person saying, you're slipping away from the world of the living, you'll soon be accounted among the rolls of the dead. And in so many words, Nietzsche says, good, because they live forever. They are the object of my search for truth, my will to truth, my will for knowledge. I wish to be the object of future wills to truth, wills for knowledge. I wish to be accounted among their roles because they're more alive than all of you living people who are really just carbon copies. The average person, put it vulgarly, is an NPC. That's just the same thing over and over again. I, from the point of view of eternity, would rather be accounted among the roles of the dead because that's really all that matters from the point of view of eternity is what legacy you leave behind. Let's go to 263, quote, without vanity, when we are in love, we wish that our defects might remain concealed, not from vanity, but to keep the beloved from suffering. Indeed, the lover would like to seem divine, and this too not from vanity, end quote. The reason it's not from vanity is because the reason why you want to seem divine is not just because you're like, I'm so great, I want the other person to think of me as so great, but because you're afraid of them seeing your flaws. And more than that, you're afraid of them seeing your flaws because when you really love someone, you want to give them the best that the world has to offer. And so you want them to see you in the best possible light because you want to be the best for them in some way. Another perhaps unorthodox place to draw wisdom, but the Typo Negative song Love You to Death ends with that refrain, am I good enough for you? And many lovers have that insecurity. Am I really good enough? And why would we have that insecurity? Is it just out of self-centered, like self-love, as La Rochefoucauld would have put it? Nietzsche says no. And I think Nietzsche is not always on point when it comes to considerations about, well, particularly marriage and relationships, but when it comes to love, I think he has some interesting things to say. And of course, we have to remember whatever is done out of love takes place beyond good and evil. I think that's certainly apropos here. 264, quote, what we do is never understood, but always only praised or censured, end quote. I definitely feel this. I think Nietzsche might have benefited, or this aphorism might have benefited if he took out the word always. Maybe said, but usually only praised or censured. Because I don't think understanding is impossible, and I don't think Nietzsche was trying to put that forward. But so often that is the sole engagement that our ideas are met with, is either that's good or that's bad, is the sorting into that, well, frankly, good and evil categories. Maybe not in such strong terms, but, regardless, I've seen some people, their entire engagement with a philosopher is, that was Abigail Thornton's Philosophy Tube video. This idea in Nietzsche's good and woke. This idea in Nietzsche's bad and unwoke. That's all that they're capable of doing is praising or censuring. That's the depth of their analysis. And that the important thing perhaps is not whether that always happens or not. The important thing is that is not understanding. 265, quote, ultimate skepsis, What are man's truths ultimately? Merely his irrefutable errors, end quote. And I'm not going to elaborate too much on this because we've talked about it throughout this whole series, but errors as the basis of our entire worldview, the shadows of God cast upon our thought, line, form, bodies, substance, cause and effect. To Nietzsche, these are all errors, and yet they're also irrefutable because they're indispensable. And that are what man's truths are, ultimately. All right, 266, quote, where cruelty is needed, those who have greatness are cruel to their virtues and to secondary considerations, end quote. Being cruel to your virtues, right? We might think of it in the metaphor of a drill sergeant, right? Okay, so you're disciplined, but are you really disciplined, right? You think of yourself that way, but think about somebody like Jocko Willink or one of these sort of masculine influencers who's always telling young men, no, go chase it down. No, you can go harder than you're going, right? Because you can always go harder than you're going. Like, are you up at 4 a.m. hitting the gym every day? If not, are you really disciplined, right? So people who have what does he say? Who have greatness are the ones who are cruel to their own virtues, who say, yeah, this virtue's there, it's something, but it's not good enough. It's not great. It needs to be whipped into shape further. And typically it's the ones who, their version of discipline, their virtue of discipline, would stand in judgment of everyone else's in the world, right? Virtually 99.9% of people. And yet they're not satisfied. And it's because they're never satisfied that they have greatness in their virtues. And, he says, they're also cruel to secondary considerations. So that's cruelty in the sense of discarding, basically just being uncompromising. This is what I want. This virtue is who I am. I'm going to maximize this. I'm going to treat this virtue like a drill sergeant treats his troops and whip it into shape. All the secondary considerations be damned. That's the road to greatness. 267, quote, with a great goal, one is superior even to justice, not only to one's deeds and one's judges, end quote. And I think, I'm not going to comment as much on this, but think about that earlier aphorism where Nietzsche says, everything he does is decent and in order, but he has a bad conscience because his goal is extraordinary. So when you have a great goal, which seems by necessity to be an extraordinary goal, because if it was an ordinary goal, how could it be great? Well, you're going to incur the wrath of the community, or all the pettiness and smallness of everyone around you will always turn against you when you have one of those great goals, and you'll always be judged. And Nietzsche is simply saying, you're superior to them in this case. From my standpoint of valuation, you're superior, even to their sense of justice. 268, quote, what makes one heroic? Going out to meet at the same time one's highest suffering and one's highest hope, end quote. That is very self-explanatory as well. That is heroism. We might say, find such a thing in war, find such a thing in a great risk for an artistic project. Remember what Nietzsche says in Zarathustra, perish attempting the great and impossible. That's heroism. It's your highest hope because you only confront the possibility, like you only have the possibility of your highest hope in the confrontation of great suffering, because suffering is involved in growth and becoming what you are, ceasing to be what you are now and becoming something new. It's a dying off and recreation of yourself, and that can happen in many different contexts. But that's the essence of heroism, is transformation, essentially. A transformation in accord with your values. 269, in what do you believe? In this, that the weights of all things must be determined anew, end quote. That we need a principle of a new valuation. It's time to reevaluate all values. So the weights of all things, the weights that might be used to measure, again, debt, credit, financial transactions. That was how you determined the weight of how much gold somebody was paying you. You put it on a scale and say, well, you owe me this much, put the weights on, right? The weights must be determined anew. So we have to revaluate. Again, so much of the language of debt and credit in this passage is funny because revaluation and valuation, these are fundamentally like financial terms that Nietzsche is using. And they're terms that speak to a quantity, once again, to a mathematizing of values. And so this passage points to that all that has to be redetermined anew. This might be the first time Nietzsche talks about the revaluation of values in his work, is right here. 270, quote, what does your conscience say? You shall become the person you are, end quote. We all know that one. Become who you are. Every person is a piece of fate. They're all part of the whole. If you want to change one thing, you have to change everything. Therefore, whatever you become is what you are fated to become. You will become who you are. Kaufmann says Nietzsche gets this from Pindar. He also gets it from Heraclitus, though. I sought myself, or I seek myself. There are just 5 more aphorisms in Book 3 of the Gay Science, and then we'll conclude. And I'm going to read all of them, 271 through 275, in order, because they're like the shortest ones in this whole book. And they're sort of, he's already been asking in the previous 3 aphorisms a series of questions, right? But these are where the answers become really short, and he's not elaborating really that much. And we're just going to analyze the whole chunk. So 271 through 275, quote, "What are your greatest dangers? In pity. What do you love in others? My hopes. Whom do you call bad? Those who always want to put to shame. What do you consider most humane? To spare someone shame. What is the seal of liberation? No longer being ashamed in front of oneself." End quote. So the greatest danger is in pity. And I mentioned this before, that Nietzsche even would bring out the dangers of pity as this contagious feeling of suffering, even within this book. We've discussed Nietzsche's critique of pity many times, but it comes out here as the greatest danger, right? What do you love in others? My hopes. So what I love about other people is that they may fulfill my hopes for humankind, perhaps a humankind that transcends pity, that transcends this sort of fixation on suffering and the sharing of suffering and looking at the world from the perspective of suffering. Whom do you call bad? Those who always want to put to shame. And what do you consider most humane? To spare someone shame. Shame's not really a cultural, it's not a feeling that in our culture we have as much, we don't attribute as much importance to it as perhaps past honor cultures would. But think of shame as really as sin, missing the mark. Shame is when you fail to live up to your own standards or to the standards of society. You're ashamed if you commit a great moral, you fall victim to vice and don't hold firm in your moral convictions, or you're ashamed if you fail the exam, you don't get into the college that you spent all your time studying for. You're ashamed if you had a great goal and you fail to reach that goal, and you know it's because you didn't really try as hard as you possibly could have. So shame, really getting into the shame feeling. What do you call bad? Those who want to put to shame. And so remember Nietzsche's earlier comments that guilt is as fictional as the guilt of the witches at the witch trials. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have utility, but again, Nietzsche wants to make nature fundamentally innocent, which he believes that it is. He believes that as animals, we are fundamentally innocent. Everything in his whole philosophical project aims at recapturing this innocence, even the innocence of barbarism, somebody like Napoleon. So those who always want to put to shame are people who want to rob us of that innocence. And therefore, what he considers most humane is to spare someone shame, to take away that imputation of you missed the mark, you're a sinner, something like that. And there's a great double meaning to calling that the most humane, because there's a passage in, I believe it's in the Greek state. No, it's in Homer's Contest, when Nietzsche's talking about the immense, how the Greeks were the most humane men of ancient times, but they had this immense capacity for cruelty that sprang out of them as like reverting to tigers. He uses the metaphor of the Greeks being like tigers in warfare multiple times, like a predator just seizing on someone, right? So it's very strange because he's calling them the most humane men, but comparing them to an animal. Well, maybe it's because the most humane man, the most human person, is more in touch with that innocence of nature within themselves, the innocence of the predator as it tears into its prey. And this is how he describes Alexander the Great. And there's also something there that's a rebuke to the philologists, because he says the philologists had tried to turn the Greeks into a kind of apologia for humanitarianism. They tried to see all of the prefigurations of modern humanitarian ideology within the Greek culture, which was not there. It was a complete projection that they had to make after the Reformation. And we're already very long into this episode, so I'm not going to get too much farther into that. But Nietzsche's reversing what their idea of humaneness indicates, and what we would normally indicate by humaneness, by likening it to the activity of a predatory animal. But the real thing there is removing the shame from what is natural, all of those evils that we say are found in nature. And so the final aphorism, what is the seal of liberation? No longer being ashamed in front of oneself. To internalize that innocence, that natural innocence that knows no shame, the way an animal would look at us and say, God, what is the insanity of the human creature? The animal as critics, right? The laughing, weeping, depressed animal. All these, sorts of the inability of their consciousness to let go of sense impressions, letting them to continue to pattern their being and everything like that. And that's shame is another one of these. And being ashamed in front of yourself. I mean, that is really the final consequence of Christianity, of the Christian moral system, because we can look at the moral systems of Christianity and just this, even beyond Christianity, the moral systems that are meant to tame and civilize mankind. We can look at them from that angle as a social project, as a project of taming. But we can also look at them from the perspective of what they do to the individual subjectively. We might say it has great utility on the social level, but the final consequence of that is a being which is ashamed before itself, a being which feels the bite and sting of conscience, which, why does conscience have utility? It might be there so that, in past times, if you committed a wrong, you would still experience, it's the way of the community imposing a fear on you so that even if it can't always directly impose its will through punishment, it can punish you even in your conscience. And we've internalized that. We've internalized our shame at being natural things, our shame at our natural evil. And so man is the animal that stands ashamed before himself, even when no one else is there, right? When it's the middle of the night and you're about to go to bed and there's no one else with you, and you look in the mirror and you think about some past way that you missed the mark and you feel ashamed of yourself. What does that do for you, right? The continued self-torment, the internalized punishment of the community against yourself that you're experiencing. Does that do anything productive? Does that enhance your life? Nietzsche would say, no, it doesn't. That is another one of these weights and values that needs to be reevaluated. And that's what the free spirit does. That's what it means to be a free spirit, is to be a reevaluation of values within yourself. To be liberated is to no longer be ashamed in front of yourself, to not carry on the shame, the guilt, the bad conscience of the community into your life, spoil the innocence of your nature. Not even from the judgments of the crowd, but just of your judgment upon yourself. To be liberated from that, that's what Nietzsche's project is aimed at. And that's how he concludes Book 3 of The Gay Science. It's been a wild ride. I am not going to summarize too much because this has been a very long episode already. But I think, Book 4 is obviously the best book in the Gay Science. And so I'm very glad we went through Book 3 because it reminded me of how good this book is. But I sort of feel like the Gay Science gets better with every book that you go through. And the fourth one is, I think, it's like a crescendo. It's one of the pinnacles of Nietzsche's whole philosophy. So after we're done with season 5, we'll go back and look at Book 4 of the Gay Science. But for now, we're going to set it aside. And when we return with the regular season, I'm going to take a break of about a week. I'm going to release, I've got some plans for releases in between, the book reading and the last leg of the season. But when we return and finally get back to our regularly scheduled episodes, we're finally getting into Martin Heidegger, Being in Time, and his lectures on Nietzsche's philosophy. So please join me for that. Thank you, everybody. Amor Fati. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.